Very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all to this open session on economic survey. Usually we conduct this session in the month of February or late January, but this time it took us around 2 months since the eco survey was released, so we are conducting it now. This session would be taken up by 4 faculties, some part by me, some part by Sunil sir, some part by Piyush sir, and some part by Ram Sudhir sir. I'm sure all of you, since you are our students, so you would have studied from either of us, right? Okay. First things first, regarding the most frequently asked question, should we read economic survey or not? How much of it do we need to read? From where should we read it? Should we read the entire survey or should we read only the summary? My advice is that you read the entire survey. Reading it is number one, an enriching experience for you to understand economy. We are all searching for a kind of a holy grail, a kind of a book where all our queries with respect to economics would be solved, from where we can expect most of the questions to be answered. There is no such holy grail in economics. There is no one book which will solve all your queries. There is no one book from where you can expect all the questions in the exam. If you read just one book, or if you think that you have that one book would probably be befooling you and saying that most questions are from this particular book. Aisa kuch nahi hai. What is required is that you have a understanding of the subject so that you are able to mark answers in the exam. Many questions in your exam would be on the basis of understanding that you have gathered. My students, most of you, I recognize you, most of you are my students. Most of the times they complain ki sir aap padha rahe ho and we are not able to solve questions. Chances are you won't be able to solve questions from whatever I teach or somebody else teaches in the class. Chances are that you will be able to develop understanding which will help you to read economic news items more carefully with a better understanding, and hence you shall become capable to answer those questions in the exam. For most questions, you'll be using which we call as intelligent guess. It's not a guess, intelligent guess. Akkad bakkad bamme wo karke uttar nahi karna hai. Intelligent guess meaning that you have some background information, and based on that you are able to reasonably eliminate a few options and reasonably think that probably this is going to be right. This is how you will attempt your questions in the exam. Not because somebody has told you exactly what was the question and what was the answer to this. ये कोई नहीं कर सकता है, ना ही आप कर सकते हो, ना ही कोई किताब कर सकती है, ना ही किसी न्यूज़पेपर में या फिर किसी गवर्नमेंट डॉक्यूमेंट में इस चीज़ का आंसर है. To develop a better understanding, you read this document, therefore, economic survey. Whatever you learn in the class, this is all what you see happening in front of your eyes. Whatever has happened in past in our economy, this is the document that contains that. Based on whatever theoretical understanding we have developed in the class, you then apply that theoretical understanding written by reading what is here, and then understand, okay, this is how economies work. From whosoever you have studied, I'm sure they would have taught you about demand, supply, economy के अंदर growth, inflation, trade-off, all these things. You know about these things. What happens when inflation increases? What does RBI do when inflation rises? What does government do to curb inflation? What kind of effect does government's policy of spending has on inflation? What effect does exchange rate have on inflation or on current account deficit? I'm sure all of us have read these things in the class. This is where you study those things. This is where you understand, okay, this is how inflation is taking place. This is the step that government took to reduce it. This was the consequence of this particular step, and hence as a result of that, something else became undesirable. Inflation was undesirable, you took some step, and that resulted in something else becoming undesirable. This is that understanding of economics that you develop by reading this thing. So, इसीलिए my advice would be to read this document completely. There is no one fact that is there in this economic survey that I can tell you this is important or somebody else can tell you. रोज न्यूज़पेपर में भी 1000 फैक्ट्स होते हैं जिनमें से कोई नहीं बता सकता है कि कौन सा इंपॉर्टेंट है कौन सा इंपॉर्टेंट नहीं है. तो इस किताब में तो 1 करोड़ फैक्ट्स होंगे शायद. सो देयर इज नो पॉइंट ऑफ टेलिंग यू, देयर इज नो पॉइंट ऑफ सर्चिंग फॉर एनी काइंड ऑफ फैक्ट फ्रॉम दिस पर्टिकुलर डॉक्यूमेंट दैट दिस इज इंपॉर्टेंट, दिस इज नॉट इंपॉर्टेंट. जस्ट रीड इट without the purpose of remembering it. There is no fact that you should try to remember in this document. Start from page 1, end at whatever last page is, 400 page jitne page hai, end at that page. You do not need to read one line second time. एक भी लाइन को दोबारा पलट के मत पढ़ना, कोई आवश्यकता नहीं है उस चीज की. Simply इस document को पढ़ो so that you develop an understanding, nothing else. Please don't read it with the objective of remembering it. If you do it, आप एग्जाम तक यही पढ़ते रह जाओगे, तब भी आपको आधा भी याद नहीं, आधा क्या 1/4 भी याद नहीं होने वाला है. तो इस उद्देश्य से प्लीज डोंट रीड इट फ्रॉम द ऑब्जेक्टिव दैट यू विल फाइंड सम रैंडम इंपॉर्टेंट फैक्ट हियर. देयर इज नो रैंडम इंपॉर्टेंट फैक्ट हियर. Nobody can tell what is important, what is not important. Read it with the objective of developing a better understanding. These are my 2 cents with respect to how to read this thing. एग्जाम से पहले रिवाइज करना है तो आप रिवाइज कर सकते हो समरी से. आई एम श्योर समरी वुड बी अवेलेबल टू यू, इट इज अवेलेबल ऑन आवर वेबसाइट. तो आप वहाँ से देख सकते हो समरी से कौन से फैक्ट्स वगैरह हमने, ग्राफ्स, ट्रेंड्स वगैरह कुछ भी दिए हुए हैं. सो यू कैन रीड इट फ्रॉम देयर. वो समरी वाला पार्ट मुझे लगता है दैट समरी वाला पार्ट वुड बी मोर इंपॉर्टेंट फ्रॉम मेन्स परस्पेक्टिव, नॉट फ्रॉम प्रीलिम्स परस्पेक्टिव. In prelims, you observe the trends. I have included some trends here, some charts here. You observe the trends. You look at happenings in the economy, some initial situation, some step taken, some consequence of that, how to handle that consequence. You develop this understanding. Trust me, you would be in a far better position to answer questions in prelims. This is your objective and way of reading economic survey. ठीक है, चलो इसके साथ हम स्टार्ट करते हैं अपना इकोनॉमिक सर्वे. आई बी टेकिंग अप द फर्स्ट 3 चैप्टर्स. टुडे आई टेक द फर्स्ट 2, टुमारो आई टेक द थर्ड चैप्टर. ठीक है, फर्स्ट चैप्टर इज द समरी ऑफ एंटायर इकोनॉमिक सर्वे. बेसिकली द स्टेट ऑफ इंडियन इकोनॉमी, व्हाट हैज हैपेंड इन पास्ट, what was the global environment last year, how did Indian economy fare in that global environment, and what is the outlook for future with respect to Indian economy. तो पहले 2 चैप्टर्स के अंदर यही चीज कवर कर रखी है. Global environment, some challenges that we faced, how did we address those challenges, what steps have we taken, and based on the steps that we have taken, what is our outlook for future. This is what is covered in the first 2 chapters. All right, let's start. State of the economy, recovery complete. That is the first chapter. We'll start with this. अरे कुछ लिखने की जरूरत नहीं है यार, मोनोलॉग है अब तो अगले 2 घंटे का मोनोलॉग सुनते, आदत भी है तो वैसे कई लोगों को. Slides will be uploaded, so you can refer to these slides. Again, useless, not for you. These are for my reference कि क्या पढ़ाना है क्लास के अंदर, मैं कुछ ना भूल जाऊँ. आपके रेफरेंस के लिए नहीं है, फिर भी आप ले सकते हो. As in they will be uploaded on a platform as well. This first chapter regarding state of the economy and the economic survey states that recovery is complete. When would you say recovery is complete? There should be some objective way of assessing that recovery is complete. 2020's mains question. 2020's low inflation and stable growth has put Indian economy in a good shape to grow at a fast pace in future. ये सवाल पूछा हुआ है. I think some of you have asked this question from your teachers in the class as well. Low inflation and stable growth has put Indian economy in a good shape. Some parameters that you are using to judge whether Indian economy is on the right track or not. You use 2 parameters. For example, if you look at that question, you use 2 parameters that Indian economy is witnessing lower inflation or lower inflation and stable growth. These 2 macroeconomic parameters, the question asks or says that these 2 macroeconomic parameters being favorable has poised Indian economy for a good growth in future. Like these are those 2 macroeconomic parameters. Similarly, our economic surveys also will be using multiple economic parameters to see that whether our recovery is complete or not. So what will be these parameters? We'll see. Recovery is complete. That means there was some shock that we went through because of which we need to recover. Recovery is complete. The patient was in hospital. The economy was in hospital because of certain factors that took place. Now, whether the patient has recovered fully or not, you will assess patient's vital parameters and then see that whether patient is right back on track or not. This is what we're going to do in this chapter. Broadly, the chapter will be focusing on the continuously challenging global environment. How did India fare in the past 1 year? What have been the drivers of India's growth? And what is the outlook for coming year? जो outlook वाला part है ये हम basically next chapter में cover करेंगे because that deals mostly with outlook part. First, the chapter deals with the continuously challenging global environment. What were the challenges of last 1 year in the global around the world? अब इसकी बात कर रहे हैं तो इसी की बात करते हैं. They have classified the challenges as 6 broad challenges that the economy faced. The first challenge that the economy faced was with respect to the continuing ongoing challenge of COVID. COVID being the first ongoing challenge faced not just by our economy but rest of the world. As a result of COVID, growth suffered. When growth suffers, what kind of policies do you undertake? What kind of policies do we undertake when growth suffers? If growth is less, what does RBI do? Increases interest rates or reduces them? Reduces. Follows an expansionary monetary policy. What does the government do? Spends more or spends less? Spends more. That means we follow expansionary policies, right? Expansionary monetary, expansionary fiscal policies. If you follow expansionary policies, what happens to inflation? Chances are inflation will rise, right? So we had the situation of COVID because of which growth around the world suffered. Because of which around the world, every economy took expansionary policies, expansionary fiscal, expansionary monetary policies. Governments around the globe spent a lot. Central banks around the globe loosened the monetary policy as in reduced interest rates, leading to a lot of money in the system in order to facilitate growth of the economy. Growth returned rather quickly, in fact. Most of the economies of the world, they contracted in the first quarter of 2020, the first COVID quarter of 2020. But beyond that, most of the economies could recover. India recovered faster as compared to other, but yes, overall on a broad basis, most of the countries recovered from that particular shock. Growth सब में return हुई. Growth returns, but at the same time, inflation also starts to build up. Why? Because there is excess money supply in the economy. Excess money because of government's policies, excess money because of RBI's, because of central bank's policies. So there is inflation that is rising in the economy. Inflation may not rise immediately. The producers may not increase the price of the products immediately, because if they increase the prices, therefore maybe the consumers don't spend again. For 3-4 months, producers have not been able to spend their goods. Consumers now have money in their hand courtesy the expansionary policies. They spend that money. The producers may not immediately raise the prices. If they immediately raise, then chances are consumers will be reluctant to spend their money again. Inflation का डर है, लेकिन अभी inflation नहीं है. Prices are rising, but at some low pace. याद है हमने एक टाइप की इन्फ्लेशन डिस्कस करी थी, creeping inflation. Inflation is creeping up. These are the things that you relate from what we studied in theory and what you look at in reality. Creeping, inflation is creeping up. You are seeing that inflation is rising. It is building up in the system. But as of now, it has not breached your tolerance level. You would require some other shock for inflation to go out of control. Inflation is rising. It's high, but not as high because of expansionary policies. Therein comes the second challenge in form of the conflict, Russia-Ukraine war. There is conflict, Russia-Ukraine conflict, that results in higher commodity prices world over. As a result of that, commodity prices are rising. Inflation was built up in the system. It was not that high. Now, because of this conflict, inflation immediately rises up. It spirals up. From inflation being creeping inflation, it turns to hyperinflation in no time. It rises beyond your tolerance limit in no time. Why? Two factors. One, excess money supply in the economy, and second, commodity prices being shooting up because of the conflict. So therefore, inflation rises drastically because of the conflict. As a result of high inflation, now what steps would the central banks take? They will tighten the policies. They will tighten interest rates, as in reduce money supply in the economy. Inflation has risen up rapidly. As a result of that, you are going to increase interest rates also rapidly. It has gone beyond control, hence you increase interest rates rapidly. So Federal Reserve and other central banks respond to this high inflation through tightening of their monetary policy. They curb inflation by increasing interest rates. Federal Reserve increased interest rates rather fast from January 2022 to about September 2022, November 2022. Within a period of around 10 months, they raised interest rates by about 4.25 percentage point or 425 basis points. तो कहाँ उनका इंटरेस्ट रेट अराउंड 1% के आसपास था, और कहाँ नवंबर आते आते इंटरेस्ट रेट हो गया 5.5% के आसपास, लगभग 4.25% की इंक्रीमेंट हुई है. Can you relate it with the recent news items, SVB bank collapse? I'm sure you would have read this thing in the news. Silicon Valley Bank, right? So interest rates increase. When interest rates have increased, general cost of borrowing for everybody is rising. In fact, that is the intention of increasing interest rates. You increase interest rates so that cost of borrowing for everybody increases. Cost of borrowing for governments increase, for private sector increase, everybody's cost of borrowing is rising. When cost of borrowing is rising, Indian government's costs are also rising, American government costs are also rising. Let's say I'm an investor with some money in my hand. If cost of borrowing for Indian government increases, now I would start to judge that Indian government may not be able to repay this debt. Cost of borrowing for Turkish government increases, Indonesian government increases, Indian government increases. Har ek government ki cost of borrowing is rising. As a result of that, as an investor, as a person who was supposed to lend money to these governments, now I assess that these are too risky to lend money to. Indian government, which could have borrowed money at, let's say, 5% earlier, is now able to borrow money at 7% or 7.5%. I was a foreign lender who had dollars with me. I was willing to lend to Indian government. American government को lend करते हो तो आपको 2% के interest मिलता है. Indian government को lend करते हो तो you get 5% interest. Obviously, lending to Indian government is attractive. It comes with a greater risk, but it is attractive. However, if American government's interest cost rises from 2 to 6, Indian government's interest cost rises from 5 to 8. Now the chances of me lending money to Indian government are quite less. Why? Because American government gives attractive returns, and second, probability of default by Indian government is high. That is, it is far more risky as compared to American government. What will I do now if I'm a foreign investor? What will I do now? Will I lend money to Indian government or not? No. Chances are I will withdraw my money that was given to Indian government. I will withdraw this and lend this money rather to American government. I will purchase American government bonds. Bonds क्या होते हैं? Debt instrument. An instrument that signifies a debt was taken by somebody. I'm an American investor. I would now like to lend my money to American government rather than Indian government because the cost of borrowings are too high to justify the risk. Hence, I withdraw my money from India and invest my money in USA. What happens to demand of dollars in India? Demand of dollars in India will increase. Why will it increase? Because foreigners who had invested their money in India, those foreigners would now withdraw their money. I was a foreigner who had invested my money in India. I would withdraw my investments. I would sell my bonds, convert those rupees into dollars and take back those dollars to USA, invest those dollars in India, in USA. As a result, demand for dollars in India is rising. What happens to price of dollars when demand rises? Price of dollars increases. So dollar becomes expensive. If dollar becomes expensive or rupee appreciates, depreciates. Dollar becomes expensive or to say rupee depreciates. Rupee depreciates. This leads to the fourth shock in the system. Rupee depreciates. What will that lead to on current account? What impact that will have on current account deficit? CAD will increase or decrease? What happens on depreciation with respect to imports? Imports increase or decrease? When rupee depreciates, imports become costly or cheap? Costly. When they become costly, you will import more or less? Less. So imports will decrease. What happens to value of imports? What happens to value of imports? Quantity of imports decreases because imports are costly. Pricier imports, therefore you import less. Quantity that you are going to import will fall. But what happens to value of imports? Value is price times quantity. Assuming imports are inelastic. Inelastic imports mean price will change by a greater amount, but quantity will not change by that much amount. Price of crude oil goes up from $80 to $125 a barrel. Imports becoming costly. Around 50% increase in price of crude oil. Will our imports of crude oil fall by 50%? Certainly not. Almost inelastic. We are still going to import as much crude oil as we were importing earlier, maybe a little bit less than earlier, before. Even though our imports have become costly, the quantity of imports has declined, but not by that much amount by which the price has increased. As a result of that, the value of our imports increases. Imports becoming costly, you're reducing the quantity, but the money that you are shelling out on imports, your overall import outgo is increasing. Same thing happening with exports. When a currency depreciates, exports become costly or cheap? Cheap. Hence you export more or less? You export more. Your one t-shirt which was worth $10 earlier is now worth $8 now. Hence you expect to export more now. आपकी currency depreciate हो गई है. Hence you expect to export more. You export more but at a lesser price now. The price has fallen, the quantity has increased. However, the increase in quantity is not as much as the fall in price. Price reduces by, let's say, 20%, quantity increases by only 10%. As a result of that, your export revenue will actually decline. Your price of exports goes from P to P upon 2. पहले P price था, अब आधा है, P upon 2 है. Quantity increases from Q, but not to 2Q. Quantity double नहीं हुई है. Price आधा हुआ है, लेकिन quantity double नहीं हुई है. Quantity increases to, let's say, 3 by 2Q. P and Q. Price earlier P, quantity earlier Q. Price decreases from P to P by 2, half. Quantity increases from Q to 3 by 2Q, 1.5 times Q. As a result of that, your export revenue becomes P upon 2 multiplied by 3 upon 2Q, matlab 3 upon 4 PQ. That is 0.75 times PQ, meaning less than earlier. your export revenue is less as compared to earlier. You export more, but you earn less revenue. So therefore, when a currency depreciates, number one, country's value of imports increase, country's value of exports decrease. As a result of that, country's current account deficit actually widens. When country's CAD widens, this will put more pressure on currency that it is going to depreciate. Widen current account deficit, hence depreciation of currency. So this is the fourth shock that the economy is faced. First, COVID, initial situation. Because of COVID, excess money supply, expansionary policies. Because of that, rising up or building up inflation. Then the conflict. Because of that, high commodity prices. Because of that, hyperinflation. Because of that, because of that, the response is Federal Reserve increase not just Federal Reserve, every central bank increase interest rates. Increase in interest rates mean increased cost of borrowing for everybody. Increased cost of borrowing means, increased bond yield means increased cost of borrowing. Increased cost of borrowing means flow of capital from emerging market economies to outside the country. As in, we discussed this, people are going to withdraw their money from India and are going to invest their money to USA. Means depreciation of currency. When a currency depreciates, that results in widening of current account deficit. Interest rates are rising. Current account deficits are widening. Interest rates are rising. Currencies are depreciating. Current account deficits are widening. The economies expect inflation to remain high, and in response to inflation, they are increasing interest rates. They are increasing interest rates world over. Every country is facing depreciation of their currency, widening of current account deficit. As a result of that, what countries respond with is what countries expect now is they expect stagflation. What is stagflation? Inflation along with stagnation of growth. When both things occur simultaneously, high inflation and low growth, meaning rising unemployment. High inflation and rising unemployment both occur simultaneously. That is when we call stagflation. Merely high inflation is not stagflation. Merely low growth is not stagflation. Both should take place simultaneously. We have high inflation in the economies because of the reason that we discussed. Plus, we have central banks tightening monetary policy. We have depreciating currencies. We have increasing current account deficits. As a result of that, most countries are now expecting a fall in their growth rates or a rise in unemployment. We are moving towards a situation of high inflation accompanied with high unemployment. Hence, most countries expect stagflation. When countries expect stagflation, they would like to become protectionist. Protectionist as in, I would not like to import goods from abroad. I would like to raise tariffs on my imports. When one country raises tariffs, what does that lead to? Retaliation. If India raises tariffs, China will also raise tariffs. That means when countries become protectionist, this is going to result in less overall trade. It is not just that India would be importing less. At the same time, India would also be exporting less. The challenge to growth or the challenging global environment then comprises of rising protectionism across the globe, which is because of countries imposing trade barriers due to their expectations of stagflation. When one country imposes trade barriers, it results in retaliation, and as a result of that, countries don't just import less, they also export less. This becomes our new challenge to growth. Rising protectionism, increasing trade barriers as a result of that, as a result of countries expecting stagflation. The next challenge comes in form of, there is an associated challenge, it comes in form of Chinese economy. Fifth challenge kya hai? China zero COVID policy. I'm sure everybody knows about this. China follows zero COVID policy, because of which China is imposing strict lockdowns. As a result of that, there is both a demand side, supply side problem. The countries that are exporting goods to China, they have a lot of uncertainty. The countries that are importing goods from China, there is a lot of uncertainty there. If you look at India's exports, listen carefully. When we look at India's exports, around 40% are quote unquote re-exports. Re-exports matlab kya hua? We import goods, process them and export them out. Mobile phone factory in Noida, Samsung, is it making all the parts here? Obviously not. It is importing almost every part from outside the country, assembling them here, and then is exporting these things. So most of our exports, they comprise of around 40% of our exports comprise of imports. If our imports become costly, what happens to our exports? They become costly, they lose out their competitiveness. So all this is happening in background because of China's zero COVID policy. Uncertainty with respect to imports, uncertainty with respect to exports. Countries that are exporting goods to China, countries that are dependent upon goods from China. All this is building up prices in the economy, in the global economy. Finally, the last challenge that they talk about is loss of income and educational opportunities because of COVID. Because of COVID, most of you have not been able to attend your colleges, those who were in college. As a result of that, less social exposure, earlier midlife crisis. More importantly, because of lack of educational and educational skilling and income opportunities, more importantly because of that, inability to get work has increased. Because you have not been trained, hence your ability to go and get jobs that are there, that are required, is less. Rising, we've discussed this thing in the class, my students might know, rising voluntary as well as structural unemployment, voluntary as well as structural unemployment. Structural क्या होता है? What is structural unemployment? Broadly speaking, skill based. Less skills as compared to what is demanded. One, the population doesn't have skills that are demanded. Why? Because they could not acquire those skills. What is voluntary? You don't take up the job because you expected better returns from the job. You had better expectations from the job. Despite there being a job, despite you seeking that job, you don't take up the job. Hence, you are voluntarily unemployed. So these pose another set of challenges to the Indian economy because of lost opportunities due to COVID. Lost opportunities in education, skilling, and incomes because of COVID. This becomes a sixth challenge that economic survey identifies. So Eco survey has identified these 6 challenges that the economies have faced. Within these challenges, एक बार revise कर देते हैं क्या क्या challenges हैं जो इन्होंने identify किए. Again, these will help you to write mains answer. First is the background challenge of COVID. Second is the conflict. Third is higher interest rates because of inflation or monetary tightening. And this monetary tightening part has a lot of sub challenges: increase CAD, depreciation, all these things. Then comes trade barriers because of expected stagflation. Then comes Chinese COVID policies. And finally, we have lost opportunities due to COVID pandemic. Lost opportunities in income, skilling, and education. These are the 6 challenges that our Eco survey has identified. Now, with respect to this, what is the state of global economy? Because of these continuous challenges, IMF is publishing multiple reports. कौन-कौन सी report publish करता है IMF? WEO, World Economic Outlook. What else? GFSR, Global Financial Stability Report. ये 2 important report publish करता है. There is one more report. Does anybody know? Multiple और भी हैं. एक IMF country specific, WEO and GFSR. These reports are global reports, as in for everybody in the world. There is a country specific report that IMF publishes, that is Article 4 report. Article 4 क्या है? Under IMF's Article of Association, meaning articles that give legitimacy, that are at the root of IMF's formation. Under that, there is Article 4. Under that Article 4, IMF carries out bilateral consultations with countries, wherein IMF's representatives will come to India and they will talk to various Indian representatives, Indian officials, and then publish a India specific report. This is an Article 4 report. Article 4 of India report, Article 4 of Pakistan report, Article 4 of USA report. That is Article 4 report. एक और important report जो IMF publish करता है. So IMF publishes these various reports: WEO, Global Financial Stability Report, Article 4 report. Under these reports, IMF will give country-specific forecasts and world-specific, and world forecasts. IMF's forecasts, because of these challenges, have reduced, as in it has reduced the global forecast for growth. It has reduced forecast for almost all countries, are now expected to grow at a lesser pace. India's forecast for 2023 has not been revised downwards. ये prelims का सवाल हो सकता है. IMF has not revised India's 2023 forecast. वो अभी भी उतना ही है. 2022 का फोरकास्ट जो था वो हमारा रिवाइज डाउन किया गया है, लेकिन 2023 का फोरकास्ट रिवाइज अभी डाउन नहीं किया गया. अगेन, दिस इज करंट अफेयर्स एंड डेवलपिंग थिंग. जब इकोनॉमिक सर्वे पब्लिश हुआ था उस समय डाउनग्रेड नहीं किया होगा, उसके बाद हो सकता है कर दे या फिर आगे हो सकता है कर दे. ठीक है। सो 2022 की रिपोर्ट जब ओरिजिनल पब्लिश करी गई थी उस समय इंडिया का फोरकास्ट डाउनग्रेड नहीं किया गया था, लेकिन अब डाउनग्रेड किया है। सिमिलरली दिस इज नॉट सम पत्थर की लकीर दैट दिस इज नॉट गोइंग टू बी डाउनग्रेडेड फॉर एवर. IMF can downgrade it. As of now, it has not yet downgraded. Other factors representing the challenges that global economy faces. This is with respect to composite PMI. PMI क्या होता है? Composite PMI जानने की जरूरत नहीं कि क्या वैल्यू है, PMI जानने की जरूरत है. ये पूछा हुआ सवाल है प्रीलिम्स के अंदर, and I expect that they can ask this again. What is PMI? Purchasing Managers Index. What does PMI tell? हाँ बोलो. Possibility of growth. Purchasing Managers Index. IHS Market is an organization that publishes it. अरे लिख क्यों रहे यार, इसमें देख लेना स्लाइड्स में, लिखो मत. IHS Market is an organization that publishes it. क्या नाम है इंडेक्स का? Purchasing Managers, PMI. This index goes to various entities, industries, services की PMI होती है, manufacturing की PMI होती है. The people who construct this index, they go to various entities which are producers and ask those producers, what does your order book look like at present? As in, do you expect your orders to grow in future or not? They will come to Vision IAS and ask that, do you expect that number of enrollments will increase or not? They will go to Reliance Jio and ask that, do you expect that number of consumers or data or average revenue per user will increase or not? So this is what they do. They go to these producers and ask, what is it that they expect is going to happen in future? Based on this expectation, they construct an index called as PMI, Purchasing Managers Index. PMI denotes expansion if its value is above 50. ये 50 वाली लाइन है. 50 के नीचे contraction, 50 के ऊपर expansion. If PMI's value is above 50, that means businesses are expecting a rise in their order book. I'm expecting growth in future. Versus if it is less than 50, I'm expecting contraction in my order book. So PMI is an important indicator that we use, that various financial institutions use in order to predict that whether there is going to be recession or not. कैसे प्रेडिक्ट कर रहे हो? अगर PMI की वैल्यू 50 के नीचे, if it is less than 50, then you see that then you expect that in future the order book looks bleak, as in less than as compared to what it is right now. Hence there would be lesser production in future. This is what PMI indicates. Important indicator. Here's one more thing. Retail sales, industrial production, trade falling. एक और indicator जिसके through हम देख सकते हैं that what is happening to global economy. Not that important. This one is important. IHS market वाला PMI. This is state of global economy. Next, state of Indian economy. How has India fared? Now they say India's recovery is complete. Last year they asked this question in the exam regarding, I think last to last year. Do you think that India's economy has undergone a V-shaped recovery? मेरे ख्याल से 2021 का सवाल है, 22 का नहीं है. Do you think that Indian economy has undergone a V-shaped recovery? This is what they asked. How do you represent that thing V-shaped? You represent it by drawing some actual charts here. Indian economic growth representing kind of a V-shaped recovery. ये चीज है. Recovery complete. This is pre-pandemic GDP level. FY20 में value of output was this much, around 145 lakh crore rupees. Right now, our GDP is more than that, around 155 lakh crore rupees. That means we say that we have now surpassed our pre-pandemic GDP level. Our growth rate declined, increased, and now is stabilizing. Our current growth rate is around 6.5-6.8% के आसपास. We expect that, ये हम outlook वाले chapter में discuss करेंगे. Economic survey has predicted that during this current decade, as in medium term of around 6 to 7 years, we expect that our economy will grow at an average pace of around 6.5 to 6.8%, which it is growing right now. अभी भी लगभग इतना ही growth है हमारी economy का. Questions will be asked with respect to these things. अब आप इकोनॉमिक सर्वे के अंदर ये चार्ट्स देखोगे, आपको लगेगा यूजलेस है, किसी काम के नहीं है, या फिर बहुत कॉम्प्लेक्स है इसलिए इनको इग्नोर कर देते हैं. बट क्वेश्चंस यहीं से बनते हैं इकोनॉमिक सर्वे से जो होते हैं. ट्रेंड्स, these are sectoral trends of GDP composition. This one and this one. 3 sectors: agriculture, industry, and services. What has been the trend with respect to agriculture, industry, services? With respect to demand side, GDP का क्या फॉर्म होता है डिमांड साइड से? GDP is aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is C plus G plus I plus X minus M. Consumption expenditure plus government expenditure plus investment expenditure plus net export expenditure. This is what is represented here. C plus G plus I plus X minus M. So these two charts representing the composition of GDP. This is sector-wise composition, as in क्या तीन sectors हैं, agriculture, industry and services, and this is expenditure or demand side composition, as in private expenditure, investment expenditure, and net export expenditure. This is what these charts are demonstrating. Is it visible? The question. I'll read it out. Example of a question. Which of the following is true with respect to post-COVID growth in India? Agriculture sector growth has been continuously negative. Yes or no? Agriculture has been the driver of growth. ये चीजें observe करनी है यहाँ से. Agriculture has been the driver of growth in the post-pandemic period. Agricultural growth, in fact, was never negative during the pandemic period. Services and industry fell below zero, but agriculture, in fact, grew here during this period. Our average agricultural growth rate during the last 5 years is more than 4%. Highest agricultural growth rate ever witnessed in India's history for a 5-year period. More than 4% के आसपास है, जो कि highest ever witnessed है. Agricultural growth has been, in fact, the driver of growth in the last 4-5 years. Services sector has been the driver of growth since pandemic. No, not services sector, because services sector had fallen. Obviously, it has recovered the recent growth because services comprise around 55% of our economy. Hence, recent growth is obviously attributable to services. But yes, it has not been the driver of growth. Driver was agriculture. Industrial growth declined to less than services during COVID. Industrial growth declined to less than COVID during COVID, to less than services during COVID. This blue line, again, फैक्ट है, याद नहीं करना है, मैं तुमको बता रहा हूं यहां से. एज इन चार्ट को जब इकोनॉमिक सर्वे की, व्हेन यू आर गोइंग टू रीड इकोनॉमिक सर्वे, व्हेन यू टर्न द पेजेस, देन व्हाट इज इट दैट यू ऑब्जर्व देयर? यू ऑब्जर्व दीज नुआंसेस फ्रॉम देयर. You see this blue line representing services, orange line representing industries. Services has grown at a more negative pace. Services is downward. That means services contraction was more as compared to industrial output contraction. So this statement is wrong. Industrial growth declined less than, yes. Industrial growth has declined less, services growth has declined more. Industrial growth लगभग -2% के आसपास थी, services growth लगभग -7% के आसपास थी. So decline in industrial growth was less as compared to services growth. So such are the things that you must be careful about while you look at these charts. Is it clear? First is macroeconomic view of India's economy, macroeconomic view of India's economy when we observe growth rate. By looking at growth, we see that we have returned to the positive territory. Our growth on an average has now returned. Therefore, we expect that our recovery is complete. That is the macroeconomic aspect. Then we look at sectoral compositions, that agriculture, services, industry. It's not as if that just one sector is now recovering. All three sectors have recovered. Agriculture never reduced. Agriculture is almost at its trend line. Agriculture has been growing faster, but yes, agriculture अपने normal rate के ऊपर grow कर रहा है. Services and industry, they have also returned to their pre-pandemic growth level, and hence we say that looking at broad sectors, we can say recovery is complete. Similarly, when we look at these components, private consumption, capital formation, that is investment, and net exports. When we look at these, इनके बारे में और थोड़ा डिटेल में बात करेंगे. But yes, when you look at these components, consumption also back to pre-pandemic level, investments also back to pre-pandemic level. In fact, investments have been more. अभी इसके बारे में और डिस्कस करते हैं और बेटर चार्ट्स के साथ. Second aspect of viewing the recovery of Indian economy is by looking at inflation and current account deficit. What is the status on inflation? What is the status on rupee and current account deficit? When it comes to inflation, inflation for the full year has been projected to be more than RBI's tolerance level of 6%. But during the last 2 months, it has come down within the RBI's tolerance level. For the whole year, it is expected to be, कितना RBI का tolerance range? 4 plus minus 2%, that is 2 to 6%. It has come down to below 6%, but it is expected that for the full year, it will still be above 6%, that is around 6.8%. Inflation is expected to continue to remain elevated, but not far beyond our tolerance range. It is not low, obviously, but it is within our, it is not low, but it is not too high as well. It is beyond our tolerance range. It has started to come down within our tolerance range. It will remain beyond the tolerance range for the full year, but it is not too far beyond our tolerance range. Hence we say on inflation front, we have been doing relatively well, especially when we compare ourselves to other economies, where in USA, inflation increased from around 1.5% to around pre-COVID levels to around 5% during the COVID recovery phase to around 9% post-Russia-Ukraine conflict. So their inflation increased from around 1.5 to 9. तो वहाँ पे लगभग 6 times increase हुआ है inflation का. Versus in our country, inflation has been around 4.5 to 5.5%. It increased to around 8% maximum. It is now back to around 6.8%. So our increase in inflation is relatively far less as compared to other countries. So we have been doing well on inflation front. Hence, that is one point that we say that recovery is right on track. With respect to currencies, now this is a question that many students have asked in the class also. Our finance minister said that rupee has not depreciated, but dollar has appreciated, right? She was right when she said that. Certainly, yes, dollar has appreciated a lot. Rupee has depreciated against dollar. If we look at only this part of data, certainly she appears to be wrong or giving conflicting statement. If dollar appreciates, it's obvious that rupee has appreciated. Dollar has appreciated against every major currency of the world. However, rupee's depreciation is only against dollar. It has not actually depreciated against other currencies. In fact, against other currencies, it has actually strengthened. Dollar appreciated against pound sterling, against euro, against Brazilian currency, against Chinese currency. All these currencies, dollar has appreciated against. Dollar therefore appreciated against India also. Why did dollar appreciate or why did rupee depreciate? ये भी हमने discuss किया है. Because of tightening policies there, foreigners are going to pull out their money from India. Not just from India, they'll pull out their money from Russia also, from Brazil as well, from China as well, from Indonesia as well, from all these countries. They are going to pull out their money. As a result of that, there is going to be increased demand of dollars in these economies. Hence, dollar will become expensive in all these economies. So dollar will obviously appreciate. It has appreciated. But what about rupee with respect to other currencies? Or what about rupee's effective exchange rate? What is effective exchange rate? इन्फ्लेशन एडजस्टेड कौन सा होता है? रियल होता है. इफेक्टिव एक्सचेंज रेट क्या होता है? Basket of currencies. Had the rest of the world had some common currency, obviously rest of the world doesn't have any common currency. If hypothetically, if rest of the world had a common currency, then what would have been our exchange rate with that common currency? Effectively, how much rupees would we need to convert to purchase 1 unit of that foreign currency? Effective exchange rate. How do we calculate it? Weighted average of exchange rates. When you take nominal exchange rates, you calculate nominal effective exchange rate. When you take real exchange rate, you calculate real effective exchange rate or real. When we look at rupees exchange rate with respect to dollar, obviously dollar has appreciated. When you look at rupees nominal effective exchange rate or real, rupee has actually appreciated. Why? Because against most currencies it is appreciating. Certainly yes, हमारा डॉलर बेस्ड ट्रेड ज्यादा है तो उसके अंदर अगर हम देखें तो वहां पे भी हमको डिप्रिशिएशन नहीं दिखेगा. बट येस, अगेंस्ट अदर करेंसीज रूपी हैज एक्चुअली appreciated. Hence she is not wrong when she says that dollar has appreciated but rupee has not depreciated, because what she means is dollar appreciation is obvious. Rupee depreciation would be actual depreciation when rupee depreciates against all other currencies. Since all other currencies are performing poorly against dollars, hence it would be wrong to single out rupee and then say that rupee is depreciating. Is it clear? So this is with respect to performance on exchange rate. With respect to exchange rate, we are doing pretty well. Certainly not desirably well. Ideally हम क्या चाहेंगे कि हमारा exchange rate depreciate नहीं हो. But the situations have been such, the global monetary policies have been such, the shocks have been such that all currencies are depreciating and rupee is no exception to that. We can take consolence in the fact that rupee's depreciation has been much less as compared to depreciation of other currencies, meaning in real terms or in effective terms, it has actually appreciated against other currencies, even though it has depreciated against dollars. Hence, second part of our statement that recovery is complete. Recovery complete कैसे कैसे बोल रहे हैं, हम अलग अलग पैरामीटर्स को जज कर रहे हैं. First, we looked at growth, not just aggregate growth, but also sector-wise or component-wise growth. Then we looked at inflation. Then we are looking at exchange rates. Then current account deficit. Our current account deficit has actually widened. Now, widening क्यों है current account deficit की? What are the reasons because of which a country has CAD? CAD is basically imports minus exports. A country has high imports and less exports. Why would a country have high imports? One, you depend upon foreign goods. You need to import foreign goods. Second, you have a strong currency which makes your imports cheaper and hence you import more. Trade policy reasons. What about demand? If there is high growth in the economy, what will be country's CAD, more or less? अगर country में economy के अंदर growth ज़्यादा है तो CAD ज़्यादा होगा कम होगा? Why? Because demand. Higher domestic incomes meaning, higher domestic growth meaning higher domestic incomes. Higher domestic incomes mean that country is going to import more from abroad. You import more, therefore there is CAD. If CAD is because of high incomes, then should we say that CAD is bad? CAD खराब कब होगा? जब growth भी नहीं है economy की, dollar inflows भी नहीं है, and then a country has high CAD. For example, Pakistan has high CAD. अरे technically समझो. Pakistan has high CAD. They don't have economic growth. They don't have any capital flows. They don't have adequate amount of forex reserves with them. Their CAD is high because they are dependent upon imports. We are also dependent upon many of the goods that we import. For example, we are dependent upon crude oil. So we have CAD like Pakistan has CAD, like Sri Lanka has CAD. But reason for our CAD is also high domestic growth. Because we have high incomes, therefore we have high domestic growth. If a country has opposite. Because we have high domestic growth, therefore we have high incomes. If a country has high growth, a country is an attractive destination of FDI or a poor destination? Attractive. You grow fast, hence you attract FDI. Therefore, we have seen adequacy on our capital account. Our capital flows have been more than enough to finance our deficits on current account. One. Second, we also have substantial amount of reserves. We have good amount of forex reserves. As a result of that, even though we have CAD, even though there was withdrawing of foreign investment, our reserves are adequately sufficient in order to finance our CAD. हमारे पास हमारा CAD है, करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट है, बट अवर करंट अकाउंट डेफिसिट इज नॉट अनसस्टेनेबल. Yes, there are red flags. High growth, weakening of currency, continued dependence on imports. As a result of that, we are going to experience a higher CAD. CAD हमारा अभी ज्यादा है और बढ़ भी रहा है. Chances are because of continued tightening of monetary policy, continued outflow of dollars, hence continued weakening of rupee, CAD will continue to rise. Plus, on top of that, if we still have high growth, which is desirable, we will have high growth. As a result of that as well, we will have CAD. We are going to have CAD because of one, desirable reason, meaning high economic growth. Second, uncontrollable reason, that is tight monetary policy is there. As a result of that, withdrawal of money from India, hence weakening of currency. चाहे डिजायरेबल रीजन हो, चाहे अनकंट्रोलेबल रीजन हो, कुछ भी रीजन हो, फैक्ट ये है कि हमारा CAD ज्यादा है और बढ़ेगा. We assess the sustainability of our CAD. CAD is high. We cannot keep on arguing about whether the reasons are good or not. We have to see that whether CAD is financeable or not. For that, we look at our capital flows, we look at our reserves. Capital flows, even though in the past 1 year have been negative because of withdrawal of investments, we do expect that the position that Indian economy is in right now, it becomes an attractive destination of capital flows again. Second, we look at our reserves. Our reserves certainly declined, but they are on the rise again. Our reserves are able to cover for around 15 months of our imports. We have more than adequate reserve cover. अगर हमारे कैपिटल फ्लोज ड्राई अप भी हो जाते हैं पूरी तरीके से, we still have good amount of reserves with us which will help us to finance our CAD for a long duration. Hence, on current account front, even the situation might look alarming because of rising CAD, even though it might look alarming, still our CAD looks quite sustainable, quite financeable. One, expectation of higher capital returns in future, and second, adequacy of reserves. These two things make our CAD financeable, sustainable. So this is the next macroeconomic indicator that we use in order to see that whether Indian economy is doing well or not, meaning our recovery is complete or not. Inflation beyond tolerance range, but not beyond, as in if we compare ourselves with other countries, we are far better. In fact, country which had the lowest additional rise in inflation. Exchange rates, yes, depreciating against dollars, but relatively speaking, all currencies depreciate against dollars. We also depreciated, but not in relation to other currencies. Hence, effectively, we are probably better. Current account, increasing current account because of high growth and more because of weakening of exchange rate due to all these policies, not in our control. We assess whether our CAD is financeable, whether CAD is sustainable or not. How do we assess? By looking at capital flows expected in future, and second, adequacy of reserves. Given that our economy is poised to grow at a very fast pace, we are an attractive investment destination. Hence, we expect increasing capital flows in future. Second, our reserves are still quite well managed, as in we have adequate reserves. Therefore, we don't expect that even a rising CAD, increased CAD, will pose any problem to us. Hence, on CAD front also, we say that recovery is near completion or we are in the right track. Clear? This is demand side view of Indian economy. जो भी हमने वो GFCF, PFCF वहाँ पे लिखा था ना, वो demand side view of Indian economy. Again, aggregate demand C plus G plus I plus X minus M. Consumption expenditure, government expenditure, investment plus net exports. When we look at exports, सबसे पहले exports देखते हैं, उसके बाद we look at C, G and I. When we look at India's exports, our exports increased. We were amongst the beneficiaries, if I can use that word, we were amongst the beneficiaries of the fallout of pandemic. Not beneficiaries as such, nobody is giving us any benefit. We were able to capitalize on this through various steps taken by the government. For example, most importantly, under the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, we had PLI, Production Linked Incentive Scheme. Through various steps taken by the government, we were able to enhance our exports. Our exports increased. As a result of that, our export revenue was rising. India was able to competitively export more. Our export revenue increased. If you look at this chart, this is exports. Blue line is exports. Red line is imports. Orange line is imports. So yes, our exports increase. Imports also increase. Both these factors contribute to imports negatively, exports positively to our economic growth. On a net basis, past में, as in COVID के बाद जो last 2 साल थे, 2020-2021 और 21 के अंदर, we were a net beneficiary of rising exports. When you look at last year's growth, last year our economy grew at around 11.5%. This year we expect it to grow at around 7%. Last year, जो भी this was contraction and this is increment. So our economy grow at, ये पूरे साल की इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ करीब 11% के आसपास आती है, और इस साल की इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ हम एक्सपेक्ट करेंगे कि लगभग 6.5% के आसपास, 7% के आसपास आएगी. So last year economy grew fast, and in that growth, exports had a big component. I'll repeat, C plus G plus I plus X minus M. Economy, aggregate demand, economy. These components need to grow for aggregate demand to grow. Our exports grew, imports also grew, but our exports were growing faster. Therefore, this had a positive effect on our growth. Aggregate demand increase. One of the important reasons contributing to faster growth was faster exports or higher exports. However, as we discussed, the fourth shock was countries are now closing their borders, protectionism. As a result of that, what will happen to our exports? Exports are going to come down. In fact, we see that exports are now stagnating. Recently, हमने देखा है कि exports stagnate कर रहे हैं. Exports increased during last 2 years, but since past few months, exports have now stagnated. In fact, we expect अगर अमेरिका में रिसेशन होगा, यूरोप में रिसेशन होगा, तो हमारे एक्सपोर्ट्स को क्या फर्क पड़ेगा? They will decrease. Like your imports are higher when there is more domestic demand, your exports will be higher when there is more foreign demand. When there is less foreign demand, then your exports will be less. So your exports are expected to reduce, are expected to lessen because of falling foreign demand. So this engine of economic growth is going to probably slow down. Chances are it is slowing down already and will slow down further. Aggregate demand because of C, G, I, X minus M. This engine provided growth last time. This engine may not be available to provide growth this time. Aggregate demand के अंदर export component. This is first demand side component of our economy. Versus Eco Surveys tells us, even though this engine is slowing down, X minus M, this engine is more than making up for it slowing down. Our consumption expenditure is rising faster as compared to fall in our exports. As a result of that, this engine is going to substitute, probably even more than that, our aggregate demand now. C is rising, consumption expenditure is increasing. Evidenced in private consumption. When you look at private consumption, मतलब household का और businesses का consumption. Private मतलब household and businesses. When you look at private consumption, let me clarify. मैंने एक चीज बोली है जिससे तुमको confusion हो जाएगा. Let me clarify. When we look at economy's component, C, G, I, X minus M, we classify this as private consumption expenditure, gross fixed capital formation, and net exports expenditure. Private consumption is household plus business consumption. Business consumption जो कि investment नहीं है वो. Business consumption जो investment है वो GFCF में है. Remember what is GFCF? Remember what is investment? Investment is defined as expenditure on capital goods. Expenditure on capital goods. Economy के अंदर definition of investment is only and only expenditure on capital goods. You incur expenditure on capital goods. What are capital goods? Goods that assist in productivity, assist in your production process. Those are capital goods. So a country incurs expenditure on capital goods. Businesses incur expenditure on capital goods. That expenditure is counted as investment. Investment के 3 component होते हैं economics के अंदर, याद है किसी को? Investment has 3 components. One is business investment, which is called as GFCF, gross fixed capital formation. Second is change in inventory, and third is residential investment. There are 3 components to investment. NCERT में दिया हुआ है. 3 components to investment. Business investment as in business expenditure in buying capital goods. Second, change in inventory, and third is residential investment. The first 2, business expenditure on capital goods and change in inventory, these are together called as gross fixed capital gross capital formation, GCF. Last to last year 2021 का अगेन मेंस का सवाल है, explain the concept of investment with the help of GFCF, gross fixed capital formation. Gross capital formation consists of GFCF, gross fixed capital formation, and change in inventory. ये business aspect of investment है. And third is household expenditure on residential dwellings unit. That is third component of investment. तो ये हमारे investment के components हैं. When we write the word final consumption expenditure, FCE, that final consumption expenditure means private, meaning household and business consumption expenditure, and government's expenditure. Again, 4 components of aggregate demand: households consumption, government's consumption, businesses investment and net exports. ये 4 component है हमारे aggregate demand के. Household consumption capital C, government consumption capital G. इन दोनों को मिला के हम कई बार बोल देते हैं दे सिंपली कंजम्पशन एक्सपेंडिचर. गवर्नमेंट एंड हाउसहोल्ड को मिला के हमने बोल दिया फाइनल कंजम्पशन एक्सपेंडिचर. फाइनल कंजम्पशन एक्सपेंडिचर के अंदर हम लिख देते हैं 1 प्राइवेट एज इन हाउसहोल्ड एंड बिजनेस का कंजम्पशन एक्सपेंडिचर एंड सेकंड गवर्नमेंट का कंजम्पशन एक्सपेंडिचर. एंड वी डिनोट I, that is gross fixed capital formation, separately as businesses का investment expenditure. सबको आगे समझ में क्लैरिटी है? 3 components of 3 ways of, not 3 ways, 3 divisions that we draw while calculating aggregate demand. Consumption meaning household, government and business का consumption expenditure. इन्वेस्टमेंट मीनिंग इकोनॉमी के अंदर टोटल इन्वेस्टमेंट कितनी हुई है, GFCF. एंड थर्ड नेट एक्सपोर्ट्स X minus M. ऑलराइट, X minus M seems to be slowing down but C seems to be increasing and they use a term called as pent up demand. What is meant by the term pent up? Pent up, भरे बैठे थे वाली डिमांड. इकोनॉमी वॉज क्लोज्ड, आई कुड नॉट स्पेंड. 5-6 महीने तक मेरे ऊपर रिस्ट्रेंट लगा के रखा, अब मैं बाहर बैठा हूं, जाके खर्च करके आऊंगा. दैट इज व्हाट इज पेंट अप डिमांड. सो दे से दैट देयर इज अ लॉट ऑफ पेंट अप, बिल्ट अप डिमांड इन द सिस्टम. इकोनॉमी हैज बिल्ट अप लॉट ऑफ डिमांड. Economy has built up demand, as in built in demand, because of people not being able to spend since long. As a result of that, there is excessive consumption expenditure. We see that, देखो normal trend is this. Percentage of GDP terms में consumption expenditure, if you look at the average, it consists of around 56% के आसपास. Versus during last year, we see that it is around 60%. There's a huge increase. It doesn't move much beyond this particular range. But last year, you look at this bar graph, this is quite high, meaning there is some release of pent up demand. They attribute this thing to multiple factors. For example, most importantly, the vaccination drive that we had, because of which the contact intensive services, they are the ones that are driving growth now. Our consumption is rising because of contact intensive services. This was the sector where our growth was curtailed since last 2 years. This time, this sector has been quote unquote unleashed. There is a pent up demand. I could not go since last 2 years anywhere. Hence, this time everybody wants to go somewhere out. Therefore, there is this rise in consumption demand. This is this pent up demand. A huge burst in demand because of demand being curtailed for a longer time earlier. The survey also cautions against this. You had a spring that was recoiled. Now you have released that spring. The spring has given you momentum, but that momentum is not obviously always. It will subside eventually. When this subsides, there must be something else that takes up its place. What is it that they expect is going to take up its place? They say that I is probably going to take up its place. This part we'll discuss in the next chapter, partly and partly in this chapter. Investment expenditure is expected to become the driver of economic growth after this thing. They expect that investment already rising, government investment through capex already rising, they now expect that private investment is also going to rise up drastically. Hence, once this engine subsides, then this engine is going to take over as investments are going to increase. पेंट अप डिमांड का कॉशन है. पेंट अप डिमांड एक बार होगी, एक क्वार्टर में, एक साल में होगी, हमेशा के लिए नहीं रहेगी पेंट अप डिमांड. Once this subsides, we expect that I will take its place and then it becomes a dominant engine of investment of economic growth later on. In order to explain this investment expenditure, they look up both government investment and private sector investment. Government investment, as in government's capital expenditure, Government has limited resources in form of some revenue that it collects plus the money that it borrows. It spends that money on various purposes. Most of the money that the government spends is on revenue account. Only some part is spent on capital account, that is investment purposes. Your revenue expenditure is mostly committed expenditure. Committed का मतलब क्या हुआ? Non-discretionary. You have very less discretion to reduce those expenses. Revenue expense is mostly non-discretionary in nature. So you cannot reduce that expenditure. Therefore, your ability to incur capital expenditure is severely constrained. You incur less capital because revenue account के ऊपर there is no relief that you have. However, as they demonstrate, the government has increased capital expenditure without a consequent rise in revenue expenditure. Revenue expenditure as a proportion of GDP or as a proportion of total expenditure has been falling. Revenue expenditure rupees lakh crore. Obviously, rupee term में rise कर रहा है revenue expenditure. But when you analyze revenue expenditure as total expenditure of the government, revenue expenditure rising at this pace versus capital expenditure rising at this pace. Since this is rising faster, hence its share in total expenditure is going to increase or not. Capital expense rises at a faster pace, revenue expense rises but at a slower pace as compared to capital expense. As a result of that, share of capital expenditure in total expenditure will increase. Questions to be asked in exam. इस टाइप से हैं exam के सवाल. They will give a statement that revenue expenditure has been falling. Right or wrong? Wrong. Revenue expenditure has been rising. Revenue expenditure as a proportion of total expenditure has been falling. Right. Capital expenditure has been rising. Revenue expenditure has been rising. Capital expenditure rising at a faster pace than revenue expenditure. As a result of that, proportion of total expenditure spent on capital account is rising as compared to expenditure spent on money spent on revenue account. Clear है? इस टाइप से सवाल. As in, please be careful about the statements that you come across in the exam in your paper. Statements में percentage लिखा है या फिर statement के अंदर simply लिखा है revenue expenditure. So please be careful when you read those statements. Same thing they say with respect to private investment. Private investment is also showing signs of rising. They expect that this is going to rise even further. How will this rise? We'll discuss in the next chapter. वो outlook वाले part के अंदर है जो second chapter है हमारा. This was the question asked in 2020. I said, sorry. Explain the meaning of investment in an economy in terms of capital formation. Discuss the factors to be considered while designating a concession agreement between public entity and private entity. अब आंसर तो मैं नहीं इसका डिस्कस करूंगा, बट हाँ, now you get to know that you can obviously supplement your answer with certain elements from here. Capital formation we have discussed, basically investment. Meaning of investment in economy in terms of capital formation, meaning how much amount of money is spent on capital goods. Concession agreement वाला part है, this is more of PPP वाला part. So you read it there. This is something that I cannot explain right now. Finally, they talk about healthy credit growth in the economy. This is something that will result in future in rising investments in the economy. In this chapter, they talk about increased credit growth to MSME sector through various reforms undertaken with respect to cleaning up of balance sheets, strengthening of balance sheet of banks and companies. We have been able to increase the credit outflow to MSME and other smaller sectors in the economy. This graph reflects bank credit to MSMEs. You see MSMEs credit growth to MSME is around 30%, meaning the amount of credit that they receive, loans that they receive are about 30% higher as compared to last year, were about 35% higher as they were compared to last year. Growth of credit to MSMEs has been rising. There is a scheme that they talk about in this context. क्या क्या schemes हैं MSME credit को enhance करने के लिए? हाँ बोलो, सही उत्तर है. प्रायोरिटी सेक्टर तो पहले से एग्जिस्ट करती आ रही है. वाई दिस? इस चार्ट में जो तुमको दिख रहा है ये सवाल में नहीं पूछा जाएगा, एग्जाम में नहीं पूछा जाएगा कि एमएसएमई की ग्रोथ कितनी है. पूछेंगे एमएसएमई की ग्रोथ क्यों है. वो नुआंसेस छोटे छोटे इकोनॉमिक सर्वे के अंदर लाइंस में दिए हुए हैं. that why is MSME sector credit growth so high? There are several steps that the government has taken to enhance credit to MSMEs. I'm sure everybody knows about Mudra Yojana. Mudra Yojana में क्या होता है? हाँ? 3 types of loan. शिशु, तरुण और किशोर. कौन देता है लोन? सरकार, सिडबी. Under Mudra Yojana, banks give collateral free loans to MSMEs. Now, an MSME is a risky entity or a less risky entity to lend? Risky. MSME has no credit history, has no certainty of revenue and expenses. As a result of that, banks have no way to assess their credit worthiness. Therefore, banks are reluctant to lend to MSMEs. Risky entities to lend, and to these risky entities you are lending without collateral. क्या possible है? मुद्रा योजना के अंदर तो यही है कि banks lend collateral free to a certain amount, about 5 lakh rupees, to these MSMEs. How is it possible? There must be somebody who gives a guarantee. Government has multiple guaranteeing scheme. जैसे ये है ECGLIS, Emergency Credit Line Guarantee Scheme. Banks give out loans and government acts as a guarantor that if this person doesn't return money, then in that case we will return money on this person's behalf. So government acts as a guarantor there. When government acts as a guarantor, what will happen to banks' willingness to lend to such risky entity? Increase or decrease? Increase, obviously. So bank will now be more willing to lend money to this entity. This is courtesy this मुद्रा योजना और उसके बाद ECILG जो भी इसकी शॉर्ट फॉर्म बनती है, Emergency Credit Linked Guarantee Scheme. This is part of Atmanirbhar Bharat package of the government. Courtesy the scheme, this is why we see this particular graph, as in much high rate of credit growth to MSMEs as compared to other sectors. Is it clear? Plus, why are banks able to lend? One is guarantee. Second, banks must also be capable to lend. What determines banks' capability to lend? Huh? Capability of bank to lend. Capital. Deposits don't determine the bank's ability to lend. Deposit is simply some depositor's money with the bank. A bank has a depositor's money. Depositor money is pure liability of the bank, cannot be used as bank's capital. Banks are strengthened to lend through adequacy of capital with them. If a bank has adequate amount of capital, only then will it be able to undertake these risks. Otherwise, it cannot take these risks. Adequately capitalized banks versus inadequately capitalized banks. Capital refers to bank's own money, apna paisa, the money that banks can use for the purpose of doing business. Banks generate profits, can use that as capital. Banks take money from their investors, can use that as capital. But banks take depositors' money, that is not bank's capital. Banks lend out the money that they arrange from various sources. Banks borrow RBI's money. वो RBI का बैंक के पास deposit थोड़ी ना है. RBI lends money to bank. It's not obviously RBI's deposit with the bank. Bank can lend this money. I am an investor in the bank. Bank takes my money because I've invested. I own 20% share in the bank. I have given money to the bank so that the bank can lend. Ashneer Bhai has given money to the bank so that the bank can lend. Not as a depositor, as an investor, or even as a lender. But a depositor has given money to the bank. The money given by depositor is for the purpose of keeping that money safe and secure. तो depositor का money वो bank की capital नहीं है. If banks have adequate amount of capital with them, that means banks have the ability to undertake risks, as in to lend their money. Because banks' capital adequacy has improved, therefore banks can give these loans. To give out loans in the economy, which is the driver of growth, credit growth becomes the driver of growth. Why? Because if you borrow, only then you can spend. If banks lend out money, C plus G plus I plus X minus M, then more consumption, more investment. Here we are talking about investment in particular. When will banks be able to lend money? Earlier, banks were lending money to only large entities. Why? Because they had credit history. Banks could lend only to them because they were less risky. Now, because banks are adequately capitalized, hence they can take this exposure to MSMEs also. How? We see that in declining NPAs of the bank and increasing provisioning coverage ratio. Banks adequately capitalized, declining NPAs, less loans are such which are quote unquote loss making. I will not explain NPAs now. Less loans are such which are non-performing. Assets supposed to perform, that is supposed to generate interest for the bank. Assets not performing for the banks, as in not generating interest. Money is not being repaid. Banks का proportion कम होता जा रहा है. Public sector banks, private banks, foreign banks, in overall scheduled commercial banks. Exam में क्या पूछा जाएगा? Arrange the following banks in order of the NPAs that they have. Public banks, private sector banks, foreign banks, scheduled commercial banks, or overall. NBFCs. सबसे ज़्यादा किसके हैं NPAs? PSBs के ऑब्वियस सबसे ज़्यादा हैं. Then private banks, then foreign banks, right? अरे SCBs तो ओवरऑल है ना, एवरेज है. शेड्यूल कमर्शियल बैंक एवरेज है इन सबका. क्लियर है? दिस इज द की ऑब्जर्वेशन दैट यू मेक इन दिस पर्टिकुलर ग्राफ. प्रोविजनिंग कवरेज रेशो क्या होती है? प्रोविजनिंग कवरेज रेशो. प्रोविजनिंग क्या हुआ? प्रोविजनिंग इज amount of money that you set aside when you give out a loan. Whenever bank lends money, NPA होने की आवश्यकता नहीं है. जैसे ही बैंक lend करेगा, बैंक has to set aside some money from its own reserves or from its own capital. Bank lends money to anybody based on the risk of that entity, the sector, and the amount. Bank sets aside some money from its resources, that is its capital, called as provisioning. When that loan becomes NPA, the amount of provisioning increases. Provisioning coverage ratio, gross NPA और net NPA में क्या फर्क होता है? What is net NPA? What is gross NPA? Net NPA is current record of the bank. हाँ, collateral minus net NPA is actual amount of loan which is NPA. बैंक की बैलेंस शीट पे जो एक्चुअल में दिख रहा है NPA कितना है, वो है net NPA बैंक का. Bank had lent 500 rupees in total, and out of that 200 have been classified as NPA. That is for 90 days, either the principal or interest or both have not returned. 200 rupees is net NPA. Against that 200, depending upon RBI's guidelines, bank has provisioned some amount of money from its capital. 200 रुपए का लोन NPA हुआ है, डिपेंडिंग अपॉन लोन सिक्योर्ड था कि अनसिक्योर्ड था, वैल्यू ऑफ सिक्योरिटी कितनी है. Depending upon that, bank has to set aside some money from its capital. Against that 200 rupees of bad loans, bank has set aside, let's say, 50 rupees only. So 200 is bank's net NPA and 250 becomes bank's gross NPA. 200 plus 50 becomes gross NPA. Net NPA plus provisioning, ये है gross NPA. Provisioning coverage ratio. Provisioning as a percentage of bank's NPAs. Provisioning coverage ज़्यादा होगी, banks have provisioned more. That means banks are strong or weak. Strong. Banks have more capital. Why? They have provisioned adequate amount of capital. A provisioning coverage ratio of around 70% is considered to be very good. So if banks have a provisioning coverage of 70%, that means banks are quite strong. Hence, banks are able to take that risk of lending to MSMEs. Recovery complete, meaning we have strong banking sector. A banking sector whose balance sheets have been repaired. As a result of that, they are able to lend money to MSMEs. Therefore, we expect that this credit growth is going to become a new engine of growth. Clear to all? They also talk about some aspects of inclusive growth. In inclusive growth, as in recovery complete में growth का inclusive aspect भी लेते हैं. There is a dedicated chapter For all these things there are dedicated chapters, but हाँ inclusive growth का chapter काफी important है, because that chapter deals with MPI as well, multidimensional poverty index. India's unemployment rate has been we have continued to see that it is falling. This is unemployment rate based on current weekly status. CWS based है ये, PLFS वाला वो नहीं है, usual status approach नहीं है. Using CWS, obviously the unemployment rate is a little bit higher as compared to PS approach. We have a falling unemployment rate. This is using PLFS का CWS, current weekly status. We have a falling unemployment rate on CWS as well as on US plus PS, that is US basis. This is government's data. Even non-government data such as CMIE data, they also reflect a declining unemployment in the economy. So unemployment rate falling, hence we can say inclusive growth also. Improvement in welfare indicators as witnessed in NFHS, National Family Health Survey. Percentage of children who are wasted, stunted or obese, stunted, wasted and underweight, all these proportions have been declining, hence we say that on this aspect also we are making improvement. Plus जो इस inclusive growth का जो specific chapter है उसके अंदर whoever the relevant teacher is going to take that part, please pay attention there. There are very important indices from prelims point of view there. MPI के ऊपर इंडिया की growth क्या है वो आप वहाँ पे डिटेल में डिस्कस करना. Whosoever takes that is really important. Inclusive growth वाला aspect जो है. MPI as witnessed between 2005 and 15 and then between 15 and 19, between 5 and 15, 2005 से 2015 के बीच में, on an average our MPI fell by around 9 percentage points every year. 9%, not percentage, 9% every year. Between 2005 to 15, our multidimensional poverty index fell by around 9% every year. Between 15 and 19, the pace of decline increased further to around 11.5% every year. So we have a faster decelerating multidimensional poverty. Please look at this part importantly from economic survey. Even a faster growth in decline in MPI, multidimensional poverty index, not merely poverty but MPI poverty. Hence, we say that inclusive growth is also on right track. Not just recovery is complete with respect to the macroeconomic indicators of investments, consumption, etc., but also with respect to inclusive growth, falling unemployment rate, improvement in welfare, health indicators, and improvement in MPI, as in faster decline of MPI. Clear? All right. एक सवाल है, करना है तो कर सकते हो. MPI के चैप्टर के अंदर करना. MPI, who has developed MPI? UNDP and OPHI, Oxford Poverty Human Development Initiative. Value varies between 0 and 1. ठीक है? Higher value means more MPI or less MPI? इंडेक्स की वैल्यू ज्यादा है तो कंट्री के अंदर पॉवर्टी ज्यादा है कम है? क्लाइमैक्स में जियो, वो सस्पेंस में जियो. सस्पेंस में जियो, कम से कम इस चक्कर में देखोगे तो सही जाके. मुझे नहीं पता, इंडेक्स की वैल्यू कम होती है तो एमपीआई ज़्यादा है, इंडेक्स की वैल्यू ज़्यादा होती है एमपीआई कम है. लुक एट इट योर्स, लुक इट अप योरसेल्फ. एमपीआई, राइट? ओके, लेट्स स्टार्ट विद द सेकंड चैप्टर नाउ. हाँ, किसी को कुछ पूछना है इस चैप्टर में? क्या एमपीआई इंपॉर्टेंट है. आई फील दैट, मतलब hunch that they may ask MPI this year because of significant improvement in MPI space of reduction. So I expect that MPI is important. बोलो किसके ऊपर? पेंटअप डिमांड पर, पेंटअप डिमांड्स पर या पेंटअप डिमांड्स का? पेंटअप डिमांड के ऊपर लोन्स का इफेक्ट. डिमांड तो एक इंडिविजुअल की है, अ पर्सन इज डिमांडिंग समथिंग. व्हेन डिमांड इज मोर, मे बी पीपल विल बोरो एंड स्पेंड मोर. So pent-up demand may have effect on loans, as in credit in the economy. That is what pent-up demand's effect might be. ठीक है? बोलो, ब्रेक व्रेक कुछ नहीं, बोलो. ऑनलाइन लाइव है, यूट्यूब पे भी जाएगा ये, बोलो. बात मत करो यार प्लीज. इफ बैंक्स आर why are they fearful of bank run? अब ये सवाल तो जब करंट अकाउंट वाला चैप्टर होगा उसके अंदर पूछना, तो मैं नहीं लूंगा वो चैप्टर. या मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी वाला चैप्टर होगा. अब दिस रिक्वायर्स अ लिटिल मोर एक्सप्लेनेशन. सो ब्रीफली स्पीकिंग, बोलो सवाल दोबारा, सबको सुनाई देना चाहिए. Why are they fearful of bank run? If banks are not giving out deposits as loan, why are they fearful of bank run? If banks don't give out deposits and loan, how will banks earn money? Banks will have to earn some money on the deposits or not? I have promised interest to my depositors. Where will I earn that interest from? Somewhere I will have to earn that interest. Now, giving out loans is one way of earning interest. But there are other investments that a bank can incur. As in, bank can make safe investments and lend money to government or some eligible corporate entities. So banks lend money not to general people in the economy, but let's say to these specific entities which are considered as risk free. Okay? Fear of bank run. ये risk free entity है. इस risk free entity की borrowing cost बढ़ रही है, कम हो रही है? Because of increase in interest rates. बढ़ रही है. Because RBI or Federal Reserve, they are tightening their interest rates. Therefore, cost of borrowing for everybody, including these riskless entities, government or other entities, is rising. So, I was a bank. In 2020, I had lent money to the government at, let's say, 3% interest. In 2022, because of tightened monetary policy, the interest rates that governments are getting money at has increased from 3% to 6% now. तो अब सरकार को लोन देना है वो 6% के ऊपर देना है. जब मैंने लोन दिया था, let's say I gave out 1,000 rupees to the government at the rate of 3% for a time period of, let's say, 3 years. That means my interest yields 3% to me. Versus in future, interest rates increase. What will happen to value of this asset? Speculative demand. Small r, capital R. Capital R is 3%. Interest rate on government bond at the time of lending is 3%. I lend to the government at 3%. In future, interest rates in the market increase. As a result of increasing interest in the market in future, now this government bond would be sold at a discount, not at a premium. Why? Because ये कम रिटर्न दे रहा है, सरकार को फ्रेश लेंडिंग करनी है तो आपको ज्यादा रिटर्न मिलेगा. If some other bank or the same bank lends to the government today, it will get, let's say, at capital R of 5%, it will get 5% interest. As a result, अगर मेरे पास एक piece of paper था और मैं ये paper किसी को बेचना चाहता हूं, how much will somebody pay to me? Will not pay 1,000 rupees, because if he pays 1,000 rupees to me, he will get 3% interest here. Therefore, I will sell it at, let's say, 980 rupees. 980 रुपए के ऊपर उसको 1000 का 3% मिलेगा. मतलब he is now going to earn effectively 50 rupees now. So therefore, I had this bond which has suffered a capital loss. Therefore, if banks had lent their money earlier, they are suffering capital loss. They had given money to the government, suffering losses. As a result of that, what will depositors do? They will want to withdraw their money or not? कि बैंक की ability to fulfill my demand कम हो जाएगी. This is basically what is SVB bank collapse. यही है SVB bank collapse है. So banks are fearful of bank run because of rising interest rates. Because of rising interest rates, their past investments have become unattractive. They are experiencing losses on their past investments. ठीक है? All right. The next chapter is medium term growth outlook of the economy. In this chapter, the eco survey broadly deals with three things. One, it deals with the reforms that have taken place in our economy in past few years. Steps that we have taken in past few years which should result in, chapter का नाम क्या है? India's medium term growth outlook. At what pace is Indian economy expected to grow in future? How do we determine that at what pace is Indian economy expected to grow? Potential GDP कितनी है हमारी? At what pace are we expected to grow in the next few years? In next 5-6 years कितने pace पे हम grow करेंगे? Medium term growth outlook. How will you determine medium term growth outlook? If I give you a task that determine at what pace will Vision IAS revenue or enrollments grow in future, you will take a look at some present data, that what are its enrollments right now, at what pace have they increased in past. You will look at some economic data, that how well the economy is doing. If people have more income, probably they are going to afford this much fees. You look at some data points, and based on that you will make an assessment that what is going to be the growth outlook of this particular entity. You look at some data points and going to assess that what is going to be the growth outlook of Indian economy. How do you improve that growth outlook? If you get to know that, let's say VNIS is hiring more teachers or better teachers, more reputed teachers, then you expect that this will act as a driver of faster growth in future. It is investing in infrastructure, hence that you expect is going to add to growth in future. You look at Indian economy's growth drivers. Growth drivers will determine the growth outlook in future. What are Indian economy's growth drivers? Basically, what kind of reforms we have taken up through which we expect that Indian economy is going to grow at a fast pace or at whatever pace. That is first aspect. Second, you look at these aspects and then you assess why has our economy not grown at that desirable expected pace despite taking up these reforms. You look at the obstructions that we have faced because of which our potential has been curtailed. We have been taking some steps, we have been taking some reforms, but those reforms have not yet resulted in the desirable growth rate. What are the obstacles that we have experienced? The chapter also draws some parallels between the present obstacles and reforms and the past obstacles and reforms. कि 98 से 2002 के बीच में what were the reforms undertaken, what were the obstacles then, and how did we finally achieve our growth? How did we finally achieve our growth that we desired in past in future? I'll repeat. How did we finally achieve the growth that we expected in past in some future? We expected to grow at a fast pace once we undertook these reforms. Let's say in 1998 we started some reforms. Therefore, you expect to grow at fast pace. However, when you take some reforms, there will be some obstacles as well. Out of your control, there were some obstacles which resulted in you not being able to realize the growth potential that you expected. Once these obstacles subside, then you expect that your growth potential will now actually be achieved. This is what this chapter deals with. Reforms undertaken in past, being undertaken at present, obstacles that were there, probably they have subsided, quote unquote recovery complete. Obstacles that were there, they have subsided, and because of subsiding of these obstacles, what is the growth outlook going to be for the medium term? This is how this chapter deals with this particular thing. Medium term growth outlook. Clear? What are the steps taken? ज़्यादा बड़ा चैप्टर नहीं है, छोटा सा मेरे ख्याल से 15 पेज का चैप्टर है ये. Steps taken to improve GDP. The chapter deals with four broad aspects of reforms. Four broad reform initiatives that we have taken. One, it deals with creation of public goods. We'll discuss what this is. It deals with trust-based governance, improvement of trust between government and the citizens, governance, good governance. It talks about reforms which facilitate private sector participation in the economy. And finally, it also deals with some agriculture productivity reforms because agriculture forms an important part of our economy. These are broadly the four reforms that we have taken, as in the chapter classifies the reforms we have undertaken into these four broad heads. One, reforms with respect to creation of public goods. Second, reforms with respect to trust, enhancing trust in governance processes. Third, reforms with respect to enhancing or facilitating private sector participation in the economy. And fourth, agriculture productivity reforms. First, creation of public goods. What is a public good? No rivalrous consumption. Huh? Saaf hawa, free air problem, public good. Public goods are those goods where the consumption is non-rivalrous in nature. When I consume, it doesn't reduce your ability to consume that particular good. Those are called as public goods. Clean air. If I breathe clean air, you're also going to breathe clean air. Because the consumption is non-rivalrous, therefore my willingness to pay for such goods is quite less. I will not be willing to pay for something for which you will enjoy the benefit also, because I cannot restrict your ability to enjoy that particular good. Hence, the government steps in and provides these goods. That is why we call them as public goods. Public goods, government provides for these goods because these goods are considered to be in the best interest of society. However, the individuals are unwilling to pay for these goods themselves as they cannot restrict others from consuming these goods. एक ऐसा गुड या सर्विस है जिसको if I consume, if I pay for, then you are also going to enjoy that benefit and I cannot restrict you from enjoying that particular from benefit of that particular good. Therefore, I am unwilling to pay for that good. This is a public good. Because I am unwilling to pay, despite me wanting this good, despite the society wanting this good, the good is in best interest of the society. Therefore, the government steps in and government provides this good. Hence, we call this a public good. For example, roads, public parks, clean air, protection of natural heritage. All these are examples of public goods. The first reform that we talk about here is creation of public goods. Government has been increasing its expenditure on capital goods. Its capital expenditure has been rising. Therefore, more and more public goods have been created. Represented in, for example, infrastructure. Electricity's installed capacity. If you compare with 2011 as base, 2011 में अगर 100 units was electricity installed capacity, today it is 215 units, more than doubled than that amount. Handling capacity of cargo ports, it has increased by around 80% in last 10 years, between 2011 and 2020. Railway tracks increased by around 14% in last 10 years. National highways increased by around 87% in last 10 years. So there has been a drastic improvement in public infrastructure. Public goods with respect to infrastructure, there has been a drastic improvement there. So this is one aspect of building public goods. Government has been spending a lot. Reforms की हम बात कर रहे हैं. Government has been spending a lot in creation of more and more public goods in form of infrastructure, physical infrastructure. It is not just physical infrastructure that is being created. Traditionally, when we talked about public goods, as in public goods to enhance productivity of the economy, we focus ourselves only on physical infra. We have not just been creating physical infra, we have been creating a lot of digital infra as well. The potential returns from digital infra, not yet understood completely, but it is expected that there are going to be quite high returns because of digital infra. फॉर एग्जाम्पल यहाँ पे कुछ एग्जाम्पल्स लिखे हैं जो हमने डिजिटल इंफ्रा क्रिएट किया है. ये पढ़ लेना, मतलब एग्जाम के अंदर ये चीज पूछी जाती है. डिजिटल पढ़ रहा हूं तुम्हारे लिए. डिजिटल रिपोजिटरीज के लिए जैसे हमने डिजिटल रॉकल क्रिएट किया है. अनऑर्गेनाइज सेक्टर वर्कर्स के लिए वी हैव क्रिएटेड ई श्रम पोर्टल. स्ट्रीट वेंडर्स के लिए वी हैव क्रिएटेड समथिंग कॉल्ड एज स्वनिधि. याद रखना, SVSV स्वनिधि. MSMEs के लिए वी हैव क्रिएटेड उद्यम पोर्टल. अब ये एग्जाम में पूछी जाती चीजें हैं प्रीलिम्स के अंदर. PM गति शक्ति. गति शक्ति क्या है? गति शक्ति इज अ पोर्टल फॉर कोऑर्डिनेशन. इट इज अ पोर्टल फॉर कोऑर्डिनेशन. वी आर गोइंग टू डेवलप मल्टी मॉडल लॉजिस्टिक्स, meaning multiple ministries, multiple entities are going to get involved in this thing. Hence, you need a platform where these things can be synchronized. What is highway ministry doing? Water ministry must know that. If there is some permission required, water ministry must be able to give that permission quickly. This is what Gati Shakti is doing. Gati Shakti एक portal है, सरकार ने develop किया. This is all example of digital infrastructure. How does digital infra help? I'm sure all of you know about these aspects. Investments के अंदर हम बात करते हैं. Return on investment is quite high when government spends money. If it spends in infrastructure, it is going to quote unquote crowd in private investment. Crowd in, crowd out क्या होता है? Crowd out मतलब there is limited amount of money to be borrowed. There are not just my students, there are others also, plus this also goes on YouTube. There is limited amount of money in the economy. That limited amount of money has to be borrowed. There are multiple claimants on that money. Government is one such claimant. If government borrows a lot of that money, that means less is left for others to borrow. Less is left for others. What happens to borrowing cost for others? Increases because less money is left. 100 रुपए इकोनॉमी के अंदर थे बोरो करने के लिए, 50 बोरो हो गए, बचे ही 50 हैं. दैट मीन्स मनी इन द इकोनॉमी फॉर अदर्स इज लेस, हेंस इंक्रीज्ड कॉस्ट ऑफ बोरोइंग फॉर अदर्स. वन, as a result of this excessive government borrowing, leaving less money on table to be borrowed by others, it increases the cost of money for others. Therefore we say that others for others it is unaffordable to borrow now. This unaffordability is expressed using a term called as crowding out. Government came in and government has crowded out, meaning government has pushed out other potential borrowers. Excessive government borrowings leads to higher cost of borrowing for others, resulting in crowding out of the private sector in the economy. Versus what is crowding in? Crowding in क्या होता है? When government borrows money, again exactly same as crowding out, except one difference. Government borrows money and government uses that money to spend on infrastructure, let's say. When government improves infrastructure, it results in increased productivity of the economy. Increased productivity of the economy means private sector, when they invest, can they expect more returns or less returns? For example, अगर गवर्नमेंट की इन्वेस्टमेंट से लॉजिस्टिक्स कॉस्ट कम हो रही है, गवर्नमेंट इन्वेस्ट एज अ रिजल्ट ऑफ गवर्नमेंट इन्वेस्ट इन बिल्डिंग हाईवेज, बिल्डिंग पोर्ट्स, बिल्डिंग मल्टीमोडल ट्रांसपोर्टेशन. As a result of that, cost of transportation overall in the economy is falling. Therefore, my producers will become more competitive. In India, logistics cost is around 15% of total goods value, whereas in China, it is around 7% only. Meaning, if India produces steel for 100 rupees, we will sell it for 115 rupees. क्यों? हमारी transportation cost 115 रुपए की है. China produces it for 100 rupees, they will sell it for 107 rupees. So because of high cost of logistics, we will never be able to compete with China. So when government invests, it results in fall in that logistics cost. As a result of that, my domestic manufacturer becomes more competitive. If manufacturer becomes more competitive, what happens to its ability and willingness to borrow? Now I will be willing to borrow more because I know that I can generate expected returns. Because of improvement in infrastructure, my ability to borrow has increased. Therefore, I will actually borrow more. Government borrowing, but spending on these quote unquote good purposes. Government borrows money, but spends this money on building infrastructure. This has resulted in crowding in of private investment. Private investment gets crowded in. सरकार ने जब borrow करके invest किया है, this has resulted in more borrowers coming and borrowing money because now they expect a greater return on their investment. सबको समझ में आया क्या है? Crowding in. Economics deals with this particular aspect. Infrastructure, all these investments have an effect of crowding in. They quote an IMF paper and say that IMF also talks about evidence of this crowding in. This crowding in is not merely just theoretical phenomenon that we have discussed. Crowding in has evidence as well. Government spends, result in better infrastructure. Therefore, now private borrowers, they expect better returns on their investment. Therefore, they borrow more. Hence, instead of crowding out, there is actually crowding in. Depending upon how much does government borrow and more importantly, where does government spend? अगर सरकार ने borrow करके पैसा इंफ्रा पे खर्च नहीं किया है, सरकार है, government is spending money on let's say payment of salaries, resorting to old pension scheme, then this is not going to result in increased investments in the as in crowding in of the economy. Okay, this is physical infrastructure. What about digital infra? Digital infra has even more but yet unknown crowding in aspects. For example, account aggregator. What is an account aggregator? पढ़ते हो Paytm account aggregator, all these things. I leave digital footprints at various places. I have a Paytm account. I use that Paytm account to make various kind of payments. I pay my apartment electricity bill using Paytm. I pay my gas bills using Paytm. I pay to vendors when I buy some goods using Paytm. So I'm using Paytm for various purposes. That means Paytm has my digital footprint. Similarly, if I am a vendor, let's say I was a sabji wala who's selling some goods. Now I receive payments via my Paytm account. That means Paytm knows how much money I am earning, how much money I am spending. Can Paytm not assess whether I will have some demand or not? Can Paytm not maintain my books of accounts there? Ki how much money I spent, how much money I received? Earlier, I was not maintaining any books of account. Hence, when I went to a bank tomorrow, a bank would simply refuse me. Bank मेरे से बोलेगा दिखाओ अपना खाता. Show me that how much money have you transacted in, what was your revenue, how much were your expenses. I would not have any of the formal things or formal books to show to the bank. But this time, because I was transacting many times using Paytm, now there is a digital footprint, and therefore now I can tell the bank that, see, this is my payments and credit history. Therefore, bank will now be able to objectively assess how much money do I earn, when do I earn money, when do I need money. Therefore, probability of me getting loan high or low, much high. Bank can assess my risk. पहले तो मेरा risk ही नहीं बैंक assess कर सकता था. अब बैंक मेरा risk assess कर सकता है, मेरी capability assess कर सकता है. Therefore, bank is now willing to, at least capable to give us, lend money to me. As a result of this, the gains to the economy, we don't yet know what gains economy will have because of this. Chances are the gains are going to be immense. जैसे physical infrastructure crowding in effect है. We know that when government spends 1 rupee in physical infra, it results in around 10 rupees of returns to the government, to the economy, eventually. We don't know that if government spends, how much return the government is going to earn when government builds digital infrastructure. Chances are these returns are going to be much higher. Government spends money in building digital public goods. The need for me to print certificates is almost obsolete now. The need for me to take my Aadhaar card at various places is almost obsolete now. Because of these things, because of this digital public infrastructure, we are expecting that the multiplier effect in the economy is going to be even higher. Reforms that we have taken, from which we expect that our medium-term economic forecast is going to rise. Physical infra and digital infra, reforms that we undertook. Clear? Second, trust-based governance. The trust between government and the public. How does trust gets built up? If government is transparent in its accounting, in its finances, that is a short way of building trust. Budget is a way of building public trust. Government declares how much money it is going to earn, where it is going to spend. These things result in building public trust. Governance, the manner in which the governor is governing the governed. How is the government, what is the government's relationship with those whom it is governing? Does it build up, does it reflect trust that public have with the government? As long as people have trust with the government, public trust, the government will have legitimacy to govern them. Public trust. Public trust कैसे आता है? There are several steps that we have taken to build this public trust. Scams lead to loss of public trust. Poor regulation, fall of institutions lead to loss of public trust. Whereas efficient regulation, transparency leads to building up of public trust. Some steps that we have taken to build public trust. One is regarding IBC, Insolvency Bankruptcy Code. Trust between creditor and the debtor, the borrower and the lender. The lender knows that if this borrower doesn't return my money, I have some way of definitely recovering my dues. IBC, Insolvency Bankruptcy Code. Earlier, if the lender lent money and the borrower did not return the money back, the lender could simply go to the court and get tariq pe tariq from there. The lender, the bank, had rights. When I lend money to you, I have rights with respect to the money. That money is rightfully mine, or the security that you have given to me in return for that loan is rightfully mine. I have a right to dispose of that security in a way that I feel fit. Sarfacy Act. I feel fit to dispose of that security in a manner. I want to sell it to somebody. I want to change the management. ये सब मेरे rights हैं जो मुझे वो security दे रही है. Why? Because you have failed to repay the money that I had lent to you. Now that Sarfacy Act could not result in the lender able to collect the money that I had lent properly. That had resulted in loss of public trust. Loss of trust between government and people. Why? Because government was unable to efficiently regulate the banking system. It is government's responsibility if people's deposits are being lent to. Vijay jo maal lekar bhag gaya. If people's deposits are being lent and somebody is running away with that money, is it not compromising public trust? Trust-based governance. Now that there is trust, why? Because banks know when we lend money, there is a reasonably high probability that if this loan becomes an NPA, we can get the money back via IBC, Insolvency Bankruptcy Code. It is a time-bound process of recovery of these bad loans. Any creditor now has a पूरा पैसा नहीं मिलेगा. बैड लोन हुआ इसका मतलब ये तो है नहीं, ये तो ऑलमोस्ट श्योर है दैट यू आर नॉट गोइंग टू गेट एंटायर मनी बैक. बट अर्लियर recovery rate was around 10%. Meaning if banks lent 100 and that 100 became a bad loan, banks could recover on an average only 10 rupees from that. तो 90 rupees बैंक का लॉस हो जाता था. Post IBC, banks are able to now recover in some cases up to 85%, some cases up to 15-20%, on an average around 40%. तो अब बैंक जब 100 रुपए लेंड करता है, 100 रुपया एनपीए होता है, banks can expect to recover far more as compared to what they were recovering earlier. If banks expect to recover more, therefore banks' losses can be expected to be minimized. Therefore, depositors are expected to have more confidence in the banking system, trust of people in the banking system. This is one aspect of trust-based governance. You build trust via proper regulation. Regulation which enables the lender to ensure, to be sure of that the money that they are lending is not going to go down the drain completely. If the money becomes NPA, I have a reasonable chance to recover lot of it. Not fully, but yes, lot of it. This is IBC, Insolvency Bankruptcy Code. Second, RERA. By setting up RERA, you are building trust with respect to real estate aspect. So again, various elements of trust-based governance, they are discussing this thing. RERA के ऊपर हम discuss नहीं करेंगे. RERA क्या है? State agency है. Real estate regulatory authority. Every state has RERA. RERA has multiple tasks. Every builder, broker is registered with RERA. They are supposed to follow certain standards with respect to the projects that they are developing, disclosures, taking of money from the potential home buyers and giving them regular updates about what kind of progress they have made on this particular aspect. वो है RERA का काम. Again, regulation in real estate which became one of the primary sources of defaults. Real estate projects defaulted. As a result of that, home buyers' money was lost. Through RERA, you are trying to protect that home buyer's right and hence building trust in the governance system. ये है RERA. और discuss नहीं करना है. GSTN. We have an online system of depositing taxes. As a result of that, online system of depositing taxes, which is much less cumbersome as compared to the old system. An MSME registers itself with the GST network, and via that GST network, MSME can comply with various aspects of tax laws. Earlier, I had to fill compliances with respect to multiple states and central government, lot of compliance burden upon me. Today, an MSME has much less compliance burden and even the other big taxpayers also. The compliance burden with respect to taxes drastically reduced. As a result of that, people are more willing to pay taxes. Government is able to collect more taxes. People willing to pay more taxes, government collects more taxes. As a result of that, Government is sending less notices to you. पहले टैक्स ऑफिसर अभी भी आ सकता है, आप इवेड, ऐसा नहीं है कि अभी इवेड नहीं कर सकते हो, ऐसा नहीं है कि सारे रियल एस्टेट प्रोजेक्ट सुधर गए हैं या सारे बोरोवर सुधर गए हैं. Probability of default is falling. Probability of frauds is falling. Building up of trust between the government and the governed is taking place. You are an MSME who was supposed to pay some tax. Earlier, because compliance burden was very high, you were not paying any tax. As a result of that, some random tax inspector would come to your premises in the name of inspection and levy a high penalty upon you. What would you do in return? You would probably pay a bribe to that person. Payment of bribe, random inspections, loss of trust between government and the public. A businessman does not know when will I be slapped with some kind of tax demand. Which law am I not compliant with, which will result in some tax inspector coming to me, central government, state government or various departments. कौन सा टैक्स इंस्पेक्टर आएगा मेरे पास और कौन सी मेरे ऊपर टैक्स की डिमांड इंपोज कर देगा. Because of GST, now all the taxes being subsumed into one tax. GST truly a one nation one tax, as in all indirect taxes except customs, obviously all indirect taxes being subsumed into one, plus it is a destination based tax. Earlier the tax was origin based tax, not a destination based tax. As a result of that, मेरे को हर जगह, मैं एक वेंडर था, मेरे को हर जगह एक गोडाउन मेंटेन करना पड़ता था. I was a person selling some goods in 4 states, Haryana, Punjab, Delhi and UP. I had to maintain godowns in all 4 states. Why? Because the tax had to be paid on the basis of origin. Now because it is a destination based state, I need to maintain godown which is one state. I will simply pay the tax based on where the goods are destined to. Compliance burden is falling. As a result of that, there is easiness of compliance, more compliance taking place. More compliance means less intervention of the government in your day-to-day affairs. Less intervention means increase in trust. How is trust increasing? Trust GST collection increase होने से नहीं हो रहा है. वो तो GST collection के अंदर दिख सकता है कि यहाँ trust बढ़ रहा है इसलिए collection बढ़ रहा है. Trust increase इसीलिए हो रहा है because government is not sending some random notices to you. There is not some random tax inspector at your door slapping you with some kind of tax demand. The compliance process has become easy. Therefore, now it becomes easy for you to comply. Therefore, you comply and pay taxes. This is how you build trust in the system. This is second aspect of reform. First is you created public goods, physical goods and digital goods. Second, you are improving the governance, overall improvement of ease of doing business, easy to comply, easy to recover money, easy to ensure that whatever rights you have, those rights are enforced. Building a trust-based governance system. Next is making private sector as a partner and some agricultural reforms. How do you make private sector as a partner? Government has new public sector enterprise policy under Atmanirbhar Bharat. क्या है ये policy के अंदर? Anybody knows? हाँ? Again, plain's point of view से important है. Government would be there only in strategic sectors. सरकार की involvement केवल strategic sector के अंदर होगी. Government is going to open up all other sectors for involvement of private sector. This is new PSE policy under Atmanirbhar Bharat. Withdrawal of government from almost all sectors except strategic sectors. ये है हमारी new public sector enterprise policy. Hence, you are making private sector as a partner. Rather than government being the driver of growth, private sector becomes the driver of growth at this time. Rather than government being the director of affairs of the economy, government withdraws itself from most sectors and lets private sector determine what it wants to do, what it doesn't want to do. Obviously, that should be in context of regulations, trust-based governance. Regulations हटाना objective नहीं है. Government का involvement business activity में कम करना objective है. Government has no business to be in business. Government has a business to be in regulatory business. When it comes to regulation, obviously government must be there. Private sector cannot be quote unquote unhinged. You would want that private sector you would want that there should be as less regulations as possible, but less less means, sorry, less does not mean merely less number of regulations. Less means easy to comply with regulations. रेगुलेशन कम करना उद्देश्य नहीं है हमारा, रेगुलेशन आसान होनी चाहिए हमारी, कंप्लाई करना आसान हो. You give self declaration that yes, I am compliant with all your laws, and if it is found that you are not compliant, then there is a punishment against you. So government would like to withdraw from most of these sectors except strategic sector. This is our new public sector enterprise policy. Next, again, encouragement of private sector via PLI scheme. PLI scheme के ऊपर I expect mains में सवाल. I don't think so prelims में पूछा जाएगा. Prelims में ये पूछा सकता है कि PLI scheme क्या foreigners के लिए applicable है या नहीं है. Applicable to everybody. ठीक है. You simply the scheme is production linked incentive. You will get an incentive based on whether you produce certain target or not. If you produce this much number of masks, you will be given some sort of incentive. More than that, more incentive. More than that, more incentive. तो production linked आपका incentive है. It is applicable to everybody, domestic producer as well as foreign producer. दोनों के ऊपर applicable है. Because of PLI, again, we have been able to attract more investments in the economy. Investments as in foreign investments. Investment in the economy have been on the rise. When you look at total FDI in the country, पता नहीं शायद अभी 2-3 दिन पहले की न्यूज़ है. दिस इज लेट इकोनॉमिक सर्वे के बाद की न्यूज़ है ये. When you look at total FDI in the country, more than 50% of FDI that we have received since independence has come in last 90 months, in around last 7-8 years. More than 50% of total FDI that we have received. Why? Because of various schemes to facilitate private sector in the economy and various reforms in order to build up trust between government and the citizen in the economy. These act as facilitators of foreign investment. तो जो हम बात कर रहे थे पिछले चैप्टर के अंदर, during the last 1 year, foreign investment has declined. Foreigners have pulled out their investment from the country. FIAs have pulled up money. However, given these solid fundamentals of Indian economy, we do expect that withdrawing of investment was more of a one-off event because of this global monetary tightening. Once global monetary conditions return to normal, नॉर्मल मतलब क्या हुआ? अभी आपने लास्ट 11 महीने के अंदर या लास्ट 13 महीने के अंदर since January 2022 you have increased interest rates by around 425 basis points. In fact, आपने नवंबर तक ही कर दिया था इतना. You have increased interest rate by such a big amount during last 1 year. This is abnormal monetary policy. Because of these increased interest rates, there has been a withdrawal of foreign investment from the country. We expect that once this interest tightening cycle stops, meaning interests become more reasonable, once inflation subsides in the world, interest rates increase do not take place, then again India will become a favorite or a hot destination for foreign investments. We are going to receive investments because our fundamentals are strong. PLI schemes also is acting as an attractor of foreign investment. So this is again some step that we have taken to improve private sector, to engage private sector as a pillar of our growth. There are other steps that have been taken. National logistics policy, पढ़ लेना अपने आप क्या चीज़ है, मैं नहीं बताऊंगा इसके बारे में. Emergency credit line to MSMEs, पढ़ लेना. Last 5 minutes. First part we have discussed reforms undertaken. Second part is shock part is very small, very easy. And the third part would be outlook for growth. Outlook for growth, already I have been explaining, please don't talk. Outlook to growth, already I have been explaining along with all these steps that we have taken, how they are going to improve the outlook. वो तो केवल एक summary है. We have taken multiple steps in past. Please, शांत हो जाओ यार. Multiple steps in past to improve our growth potential, to facilitate growth. However, these steps have yet not resulted in the expected growth. We draw parallels between 98 and 2002. We took a lot of structural reforms in the economy then. We undertook massive infrastructure push, for example, by something called as Golden Quadrilateral. We started with the disinvestments during that time. We started with modernization of regulators. Building Trust, Sarfacy Act उस समय आई है. Building Trust, FRBM Act. Sarfacy Act that recognize IBC अब है और पहले Sarfacy थी. अभी भी Sarfacy exist करती है obviously. IBC enables the banks to recover their money. Sarfacy recognizes the rights of banks to recover the dues with respect to certain securities. So in 2002 when Sarfacy Act came, Sarfacy was quite a revolutionary step then. Why? Because it was meant to improve banks' ability to recover their dues. Trust based. FRBM Act, Fiscal Responsibility Budget Management Act, through which there was a imposed restriction upon government's borrowing कि सरकार कितना borrow कर सकती है उसके ऊपर limit होनी चाहिए. Why? Because if government borrows excessively, this is going to result in poor government finances, going to result in increased cost of borrowing for future governments, going to result in intergenerational and intragenerational inequity. Present government borrows, future government, that is future taxpayer pays. Present government borrows results in crowding out and hence cost of credit in the economy increases. Present government borrows and spend results in inflation leading to worse effects for the poor in the economy. Poor suffer more because of inflation as compared to non-poor. So government debt causes inequity, intergenerational and intragenerational. FRBM Act put restrictions on government debt. So there are a lot of parallels to be drawn between the present phase and that phase. Structural reforms, infrastructure push, trust-based reforms, governance reforms, agricultural reforms, disinvestment, involvement of private sector, and similar reforms during this phase. In that phase, again, there were some obstacles. Example, less FDI in India because of restrictions, because of sanction on us due to nuclear tests. Less foreign investment because of volatility in forex markets due to dot-com bubble and other aspects in global economy at that time. 97 to 2000 Asian financial crisis, outflow of foreign investment from Asia to rest of the world, as in mostly to US. Dot-com bubble 2002. Because of that, global markets collapsed. As a result of that, again, withdrawal of foreign investments from India to rest of the world. Similarly, COVID, tight monetary policy, withdrawal of foreign investments from India to rest of the world. So we took some steps then, but there were some obstacles at that time. We have taken some steps now, but there have been these continuing obstacles we discussed in the last chapter, जो हमारे 6 challenge to growth है. These obstacles have been preventing us from realizing our growth potential, which we could have realized because of the steps that we have taken. Now we expect that these challenges have subsided. Now we are poised for greater growth. We expect that monetary tightening is not going to continue from here. We expect that COVID-related shocks are now going to subside or have subsided already. We expect that whatever foreign investment was withdrawn has been withdrawn. Now it can only come up from this point. We expect that whatever crisis the banks faced earlier, that crisis has subsided, banks' balance sheets have improved, strengthened, and therefore banks will now be able to lend again, as seen in their increased MSME lending. We expect these positive things to happen from now onwards. Hence, we expect that our outlook for future is going to be better. We expect that we are going to grow at around 6% because of the infrastructure push that we have undertaken. Beyond that, we expect around 0.5 percentage point of growth will be added because of digital infra push. Beyond that, we expect that around 0.3 percentage points will be added because of trust-based governance and other initiatives that we have taken. Therefore, economic survey projects that in the medium term, we expect to grow between 6.5 to 7% के आसपास. Our growth outlook is quite positive. It's quite quote unquote bullish. Why? Because of reforms that we have undertaken in past and an expected subsiding of obstacles. Just one obstacle we'll discuss. Subsiding का एक part हमने discuss नहीं किया, just last part discuss करना है. Outlook वाला part में तुमको बता दिया how do we expect. The obstacle that we expect to subside is most importantly banks balance sheets. जो credit growth की हम बात कर रहे हैं. Banks balance sheets are expected to improve drastically, have already improved, and this improvement is expected to increase in investments because of lending by the banks. Our NPAs increased. Peak of our NPAs was in 2017-18. 2017 में हमारे NPAs maximum थे, because of which there was a lot of provisioning and hence less capital available with the bank. Banks were completely inadequately capitalized. In 2018, once banks started to correct, banks की capital position थोड़ी ठीक होने लगी, उसके बाद the second wave of crisis came in form of NBFC crisis. We recognized banks' failure earlier, banks important critical aspect of the economy. We cleaned up banks balance sheets and hence because we cleaned up तो हमने कारपेट उठाया, वहां से काफी सारी डस्ट निकली. Because of that we witnessed NPAs maximizing in 2017. Loans were not given then. Loans were given between 2007, 8, 9, 10. But those loans were evergreen, not recognized as NPAs. They were restructured again and again. You started to recognize those bad loans, and because of that recognition, the bad loans peak in 2017. Once you started to clean up the bank's balance sheets, simultaneous problem occurred in NBFC's balance sheets. NBFC के अंदर जब cleaning up start हुई, तो one of the biggest NBFCs, IL&FS, Infrastructure Leasing and Financial Services, that collapsed. Why? Because it was found out that most of their loans are also bad loans. Because the NBFC did not have adequate amount of capital with them. It had lent money not on the basis of proper risk analysis. Hence, money did not come back to it. Therefore, it collapsed. Apart from that, when one collapses, there is going to be a domino effect as well. When one collapsed, other NBFCs also collapsed. For example, DHFL, Diwan Housing Finance Limited. There were other big NBFCs that collapsed because of the crisis that unfolded in NBFC sector. Because of increased support by the government in form of capital adequacy, because of steps taken to improve credit worthiness due to digital infrastructure push, more lending by the banks and therefore more profits that they are able to earn, because of increased cost of borrowings outside the banks, increased bonds, increased costs from foreign sources ECB. अगर बाहर से कॉस्ट इंक्रीज होगी तो बोरोवर बैंक से बोरो करेगा कि नहीं? If cost of borrowing via issuing bonds is rising, cost of borrowing via foreign markets, ECB, external commercial borrowing is rising, therefore demand of loans from banks will increase or not? Demand of loans from bank increased because of one, better balance sheets, improvement of balance sheets of borrowers, corporates. Higher cost of borrowing from outside the bank, therefore increased borrowing from the bank. Plus improved balance sheets of the banks, therefore greater ability to lend, greater demand and greater ability. Therefore now we are seeing a pickup of bank credit. This graph tells us the credit to GDP gap. इकोनॉमी की ग्रोथ कितनी है, जीडीपी कितनी है और क्रेडिट कितना है. You see this graph here, यहाँ पे क्या नंबर आया? लगभग 20 के आसपास. Meaning what? Credit in the economy is around 120% of GDP. GDP 100 and credit 120. लोगों ने इकोनॉमी के अंदर, पूरी इकोनॉमी ने कितना पैसा बोरो कर रखा है? The total lending in the economy, let's say around 120% of the GDP. Everybody in the economy, we have borrowed some money. What is the value of our borrowing? It is around 120%. So 120% हमारी borrowing है, तो इसलिए number 20 आ रहा है. ठीक है, 120 minus 120. You see from this point onwards, it starts to decline. Credit in the economy starts to decline and the gap maximizes somewhere around 2017-18. यहाँ पे gap maximize हो रहा है at this point. Meaning what? That at this point around 20% के आसपास है. Meaning at this point credit to GDP ratio is around 80%. GDP is 100, credit is 80%, therefore -20 का gap है. Why this -20 gap? This -20 gap is there because at this point banks are unwilling to lend and unable to lend. But now you see this gap has been declining. We expect that this is now going to move up like this. Meaning we expect that growth outlook, अब हम देख रहे हैं कि ये कम हो रहा है gap. Therefore we expect more lending by the banks because of better capability, better ability of the borrower to repay. Hence, this important constraint of growth is going to subside. Growth का एक domestic growth का बहुत important constraint क्या है? Private consumption will be facilitated by borrowing. Investment will be facilitated by borrowing. Investment by MSMEs, investment by government, investment by big corporates will all be facilitated by borrowing. If borrowing in the economy, that is lending by the banks, increases, this is going to act as an important engine of growth in future. More consumption, more investment, more government spending. This is what we expect is going to actually release or unleash our economic growth in years to come. This is expected to be the biggest driver of investment. Improved investments, public infrastructure plus digital infrastructure, better trust. बेटर ट्रस्ट का जो पार्ट आईबीसी का है वो यहां पे आ रहा है. आईबीसी हैज रिजल्टेड इन बैंक्स बिकमिंग मोर केपेबल एंड मोर विलिंग टू लेंड मनी इन द इकोनॉमी. दिस इज समथिंग दैट इज गोइंग टू कंट्रीब्यूट मैक्सिमम टू अवर इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ इन फ्यूचर. दिस इज व्हाट दे से. हमारा आउटलुक ब्राइट क्यों है? बिकॉज ऑफ रिपेयर ऑफ बैंक्स बैलेंस शीट्स एंड रिपेयर ऑफ बोरोवर्स बैलेंस शीट. जो ट्विन बैलेंस शीट प्रॉब्लम थी पहले कि बैंक की बैलेंस शीट खराब है प्लस बोरोवर की खराब है, अब वो बैलेंस शीट प्रॉब्लम रिवर्स हो गई है. दोनों की बैलेंस शीट अच्छी होती जा रही है. मोर विलिंगनेस, मोर एबिलिटी, हेंस बेटर लेंडिंग, देयरफॉर बेटर आउटलुक फॉर ग्रोथ. ठीक है, दिस इज व्हाट दिस चैप्टर इज. चलो कल मिलते हैं. कल एक चैप्टर डिस्कस करेंगे. कल वाला डिस्कशन हमारा 1.5 घंटे का होगा मेरे ख्याल से. एक ही चैप्टर है कल, तो वील डिस्कस दैट वन चैप्टर टुमारो. थर्ड चैप्टर रेवेन्यू रिलिश. होपफुली ज्यादा लंबा नहीं हो. Take care. Bye-bye. I'll take up your questions tomorrow because, listen, tomorrow our discussion is going to be of less duration. So I'll take up any questions tomorrow. आज सवाल नहीं ले रहा हूँ. Fine.